Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The call came in just after 6 in the evening, right when the desert sun was starting to dip below the jagged ridgeline west of Shiprock. Officer Ray Yazzie had been sitting in his patrol unit outside the chapter house, finishing up paperwork from a domestic disturbance call earlier that day, when the radio crackled to life with that particular tone of urgency that made every cop's stomach tighten just a little bit. Dispatch reported a missing woman, last seen heading toward the Mesa country north of town, and the reporting party, a coworker from the trading post, said she'd been gone since late morning and wasn't answering her phone. Ray pulled his notepad closer, jotting down the details as the dispatcher relayed them. Claire Atwood, 32 years old, white female, blonde hair, about 5'6", driving a tan Ford Explorer with New Mexico plates. She worked part-time at the Hogback trading post and had told her supervisor she was heading out to photograph some rock formations for a project she was working on. Something about documenting traditional Navajo landmarks for a cultural preservation grant. She'd left around 10 that morning with a camera, a backpack, and a promise to be back by 3. It was now past 6, and no one had heard from her. Ray acknowledged the call, started his unit, and pulled out onto Highway 491, heading north toward the area where Claire had supposedly gone. The road stretched out before him, flat and empty, with the great stone monolith of Shiprock rising in the distance like a sentinel guarding the desert. He'd grown up out here, spent his whole life in the shadow of that rock, and he knew the land better than most. The Mesa country north of town was beautiful in its own harsh way, all red stone and sagebrush and silence, but it was also unforgiving. People got lost out there, people got hurt, and sometimes people just disappeared. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had jurisdiction over most of the reservation, but the Navajo Tribal Police handled the day-to-day calls, and Ray had been doing this job for almost 8 years now. He'd seen his share of missing persons cases, and most of them ended one of 2 ways. Either you found the person alive, embarrassed and dehydrated but otherwise okay, or you found them too late. There wasn't much middle ground. The drive took him about 20 minutes, and by the time he reached the turnoff that led toward the mesa, the sun was sitting heavy and orange on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. He followed the dirt road as far as it would take him, his unit bouncing over washboard ruts and loose gravel, until he spotted the Explorer parked near the base of a low rise. Ray pulled up behind it, killed the engine, and stepped out into the cooling evening air. The wind was picking up, the way it always did out here at dusk, carrying with it the smell of juniper and dust. He approached the vehicle slowly, his hand instinctively resting on his duty belt, and peered through the driver's side window. The Explorer was empty, keys still in the ignition, a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder, and a camera bag sitting on the passenger seat. The doors were unlocked. Ray opened the driver's door and leaned in, scanning the interior for anything that might tell him where Claire had gone. There was a map folded on the dashboard, marked with a few pencil circles indicating spots she'd probably wanted to check out, and a small day pack on the back seat that looked like it contained snacks, sunscreen, and a first aid kit. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing looked wrong, but the fact that her keys and camera bag were still in the car told him she hadn't planned on being gone long. He stepped back from the vehicle and looked around, trying to get his bearings. The mesa rose up ahead of him, a massive table of sandstone and shale, its surface broken by deep arroyos and narrow canyons. There were a dozen different ways she could have gone, a dozen different trails and washes that wound through the rock, and most of them looked exactly the same. Ray pulled his radio from his belt and called it in, letting dispatch know he'd found the vehicle and was going to start a preliminary search on foot. The dispatcher acknowledged and said they'd send backup, but it would take time. The nearest unit was over in Red Valley, at least 40 minutes away, and by the time they got there it would be full dark. Ray clipped the radio back onto his belt, grabbed his flashlight from the unit and started walking toward the base of the mesa, scanning the ground for any sign of Claire's passage. The terrain was rough, all loose rock and scattered boulders, and it took him a few minutes to pick up a trail. He found it near the mouth of a narrow arroyo, a set of boot prints in the soft sand that led deeper into the canyon. They were small, consistent with a woman's hiking boots, and they were fresh, probably made within the last few hours. Ray followed them, moving carefully, his eyes sweeping back and forth across the ground. The arroyo walls rose up on either side of him, red stone streaked with black and orange, and the sound of the wind echoed off the rock in a low, hollow way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up just a little. He'd been in places like this 100 times before, but there was something about the way the light was fading, the way the shadows were growing longer and darker, that made him feel like he was being watched. He followed the tracks for maybe a quarter mile, deeper into the canyon until they veered off to the left and started climbing up a steep slope toward the top of the mesa. Ray paused, looking up at the climb ahead of him, and checked his watch. It was almost 7 now, and the sun was nearly gone, just a thin slice of orange on the horizon. He had maybe 20 minutes of good light left, if that, and then it would be full dark. He keyed his radio again, updating dispatch on his position, and then started the climb. The slope was steep and loose, and he had to use his hands in places, grabbing onto rock outcroppings and scrub brush to pull himself up. By the time he reached the top, he was breathing hard, and his shirt was sticking to his back with sweat. He stood there for a moment, catching his breath, and looked around. The top of the mesa was flat and open, stretching out in all directions, a vast expanse of red rock and patchy grass. The wind was stronger up here, gusting hard enough to make his eyes water, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees. Ray turned on his flashlight and swept the beam across the ground, looking for the boot prints again, but the surface up here was mostly solid rock, and he couldn't find any clear sign of which way Claire had gone. He started walking in the direction the tracks had been heading, moving slowly, calling out her name every few steps. "Claire! Claire Atwood! This is Officer Yazzie with the Navajo Tribal Police. If you can hear me, call out!" His voice was swallowed up by the wind, carried away across the empty mesa, and there was no response. He kept walking, sweeping his flashlight back and forth, the beam cutting through the gathering darkness. He walked for maybe another 10 minutes, covering a couple 100 yards of open ground, when he saw something that made him stop. There, on the ground about 20 feet ahead of him, was a small pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, one on top of the other, in a way that didn't look natural. Ray approached it slowly, shining his light on the rocks, and that's when he noticed the pattern. The rocks weren't just stacked, they were arranged in a specific way, with the largest at the bottom and the smallest at the top, and there were symbols scratched into the surface of the top rock, crude but deliberate. Ray didn't recognize the symbols, didn't know if they were traditional Navajo markings or something else, but something about them made him uneasy. He looked around, scanning the area with his flashlight, and that's when he saw the second pile, and then the third. They were spaced about 30 feet apart, forming a rough line that led across the mesa, and each one had the same symbols scratched into the top rock. Ray felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the wind. He'd been out here long enough to know that people did strange things in the desert, left behind all kinds of markers and cairns and offerings, but something about these rock piles felt wrong. They felt deliberate, purposeful, like someone had put them there for a reason. He followed the line of cairns, moving faster now, his instincts telling him that something was very wrong. The line led him toward the northern edge of the mesa, where the ground dropped away into a deep canyon, and as he got closer he could hear something over the sound of the wind. It was faint, barely audible, but it sounded like a low hum, a vibration in the air that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ray stopped at the edge of the mesa and looked down into the canyon below. It was deep, maybe 200 feet, and the bottom was lost in shadow. He couldn't see anything down there, couldn't see any sign of Claire, but the humming sound was louder here, resonating up from the depths of the canyon like the sound of distant machinery. He pulled his radio and tried to call it in, but all he got was static. The signal was dead, probably blocked by the rock walls of the canyon, and for the first time since he'd started this search, Ray felt genuinely afraid. He looked back the way he'd come, back toward the distant lights of town, and then looked down into the canyon again. The smart thing to do would be to wait for backup, wait for the other officers to arrive, but he knew that by the time they got here it would be full dark, and if Claire was down there, if she was hurt or trapped, every minute counted. He made the decision in less than 5 seconds, clipping his radio back onto his belt and starting down the slope into the canyon. The descent was treacherous, the rock loose and crumbling under his boots, and he had to move slowly, testing each foothold before putting his weight on it. The humming sound grew louder as he descended, filling his ears, vibrating in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was descending into something he didn't understand, something that was waiting for him at the bottom. By the time he reached the canyon floor, it was almost completely dark, the last remnants of twilight fading from the sky above. Ray turned on his flashlight and swept the beam around, taking in his surroundings. The canyon was narrow, maybe 30 feet across, with sheer walls rising up on both sides. The floor was littered with fallen rocks and dead brush, and there, near the far wall, was something that made his blood run cold. It was a backpack, the same color and style as the one he'd seen in Claire's vehicle, lying on the ground next to a large boulder. Ray approached it slowly, his hand moving to his sidearm, and that's when he saw the blood. It was on the boulder, a dark smear that looked black in the beam of his flashlight, and there were drag marks in the dirt leading away from it, deeper into the canyon. Ray's heart was pounding now, his mouth dry, and he followed the drag marks, moving as quietly as he could, the humming sound in his ears making it hard to think. The drag marks led him around a bend in the canyon, and that's when he saw her. Claire Atwood was lying on the ground about 50 feet ahead of him, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm pinned beneath her. Ray rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands moving to her neck to check for a pulse. She was alive, barely, her breathing shallow and ragged, and there was blood on her face, on her hands, soaking into the dirt beneath her. Ray pulled his radio, tried again to call for help, but the static was worse now, a roar of white noise that made it impossible to transmit. He tossed the radio aside and turned his attention back to Claire, checking her for injuries. Her left leg was bent at a bad angle, probably broken, and there was a deep gash on the side of her head that was still bleeding. He pulled off his jacket, wadded it up, and pressed it against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Claire," he said, his voice urgent. "Claire, can you hear me? My name is Ray Yazzie. I'm with the tribal police. You're going to be okay. I'm going to get you out of here." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts fear and confusion. "He's here," she whispered, her voice so faint he almost didn't hear it. "He's been watching me." Ray felt his stomach drop. "Who's here? Who's been watching you?" Claire's eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp, unconscious, and Ray swore under his breath. He looked around, scanning the canyon with his flashlight, and that's when he realized the humming sound had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive. The kind of silence that felt like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him. And then, from somewhere behind him, he heard footsteps. Ray spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and that's when he saw the figure standing at the mouth of the canyon. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend into the shadows, and it was just standing there, watching him. Ray's hand went to his sidearm, his fingers closing around the grip, and he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is the Navajo Tribal Police. Identify yourself." The figure didn't move, didn't respond, and for a moment Ray thought it might not be a person at all, might be some trick of the light, some shadow cast by the rocks. But then it took a step forward, and Ray saw the eyes. They caught the beam of his flashlight and reflected it back at him, glowing in the darkness like the eyes of an animal, and Ray felt every instinct in his body screaming at him to run. But he didn't run. He couldn't. Claire was lying at his feet, bleeding and unconscious, and there was no way he was going to leave her. He drew his sidearm, leveling it at the figure, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Stop right there," he said, his voice hard. "Don't come any closer." The figure stopped, tilted its head slightly as if considering him, and then it spoke. The voice was low, guttural, and it didn't sound quite human, the words distorted in a way that made Ray's skin crawl. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is not a place for you." Ray kept his weapon trained on the figure, his finger on the trigger. "I'm taking her out of here. If you try to stop me, I will shoot." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can try," it said, and then it moved. It moved faster than anything Ray had ever seen, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye, and suddenly it was on him. Ray fired, the muzzle flash lighting up the canyon, but the figure didn't stop. It slammed into him, knocking him backward, and Ray felt his head hit the ground hard enough to make his vision swim. The flashlight went flying, spinning across the ground, and for a moment everything was chaos, a blur of movement and pain and darkness. Ray fought back, throwing punches, trying to get the thing off him, but it was impossibly strong, its hands like iron around his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and the edges of his vision were starting to go dark when suddenly the pressure was gone. The figure released him, stepping back, and Ray gasped for air, rolling onto his side, his hand scrabbling for his weapon. But when he looked up, the figure was gone. It had vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace, no sound, nothing but the echo of its laughter still ringing in Ray's ears. Ray lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then he heard Claire moan behind him, and instinct took over. He pushed himself to his feet, grabbed his flashlight, and went back to her side. He had to get her out of here, had to get them both out of here before that thing came back. He bent down, scooping her up as gently as he could, and started back toward the slope he'd descended, every step an effort, his body aching from the fight. The climb out of the canyon was a nightmare, made worse by the fact that he was carrying Claire's weight and his own injuries. By the time he reached the top of the mesa, his lungs were burning, and his legs felt like they were going to give out. But he didn't stop. He kept moving, across the open ground, back toward the arroyo, down the slope, until finally, blessedly, he saw the lights of his patrol unit in the distance. He made it back to the vehicle just as backup arrived, 2 other tribal officers pulling up in their units, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Ray laid Claire down on the ground, waving the officers over, and within minutes they had called for an ambulance and were working to stabilize her. One of the officers, a younger guy named Bigay, looked at Ray and asked what had happened. Ray opened his mouth to answer, to tell them about the figure in the canyon, about the humming sound and the rock cairns, and the eyes that glowed in the dark. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain what he'd seen? How could he make them believe him? In the end, he just shook his head and said, "I don't know, but something's out there." The ambulance took Claire Atwood to the Northern Navajo Medical Center in Shiprock just after 9 that night, and Ray Yazzie spent the next 3 hours at the station filing his incident report. He sat at his desk in the small squad room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and stared at the blank screen of his computer for a long time before he started typing. The other officers had cleared out for the night, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the sound of the old building settling around him. His supervisor, Captain Franklin So, had told him to take his time with the report, to be thorough, and Ray knew what that meant. It meant they wanted every detail, every observation, everything he'd seen and heard out there on the mesa. But how was he supposed to write about what had happened in that canyon? How was he supposed to put into words the feeling of those hands around his throat, the sound of that voice, the sight of those glowing eyes in the darkness? He started with the facts, the objective details that any officer would include in a missing person case. He described finding Claire's vehicle, following her tracks into the arroyo, climbing up to the mesa, discovering the rock cairns. He wrote about the descent into the canyon, finding Claire injured and unconscious, the blood on the boulder and the drag marks in the dirt. And then he came to the part where he'd seen the figure, and his fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Ray had been a cop long enough to know how these things worked. You report something strange, something that doesn't fit into the neat categories of standard police work, and people start looking at you differently. They start questioning your judgment, your reliability, your fitness for duty. He'd seen it happen to other officers, good cops who'd reported things they couldn't explain, and he'd watched their careers slowly unravel as a result. But he'd also taken an oath to tell the truth, and the truth was that something had been in that canyon with him, something that had attacked him and then vanished without a trace. So he wrote it down. He described the figure in as much detail as he could remember: the height, the dark clothing, the eyes that had reflected his flashlight beam. He wrote about the physical confrontation, about firing his weapon and missing, about being knocked to the ground and nearly strangled before the figure disappeared. When he finished typing, he read through the report twice, checking for any errors or inconsistencies, and then he saved it and sent it to Captain So's inbox. It was after midnight by the time he logged out of the system, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the parking lot. The night air was cold and still, and the sky above was filled with stars, so many that they looked like salt spilled across black velvet. Ray stood there for a moment, breathing in the desert air, and tried to shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He drove home to his small house on the eastern edge of town, a one-bedroom place he'd bought a few years back when he'd finally saved up enough for a down payment. It wasn't much, but it was his, and after the chaos of the evening it felt good to walk through the front door and lock it behind him. He took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the grime and the fear, and then he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat down on the couch with the lights off. He didn't want to sleep, didn't want to close his eyes because he knew what he'd see when he did. Those eyes, glowing in the darkness, watching him. He sat there in the silence, sipping his drink, until exhaustion finally pulled him under sometime around 3 in the morning. The phone woke him just after 7, the shrill ring cutting through his dreamless sleep like a knife. Ray fumbled for it on the coffee table, his head pounding, and managed to croak out a greeting. It was Captain So, and his voice was tense. "Yazzie, I need you to come in. We need to talk about your report." Ray sat up, rubbing his eyes, trying to clear the fog from his brain. "What about it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then So said, "Just come in. We'll talk when you get here." The line went dead, and Ray stared at the phone for a moment before setting it down. He had a bad feeling about this, a sick knot in his stomach that told him the conversation he was about to have wasn't going to go well. He got dressed, skipped breakfast, and drove to the station, arriving just before 8. Captain Franklin So was waiting for him in his office, a cramped space at the back of the building that smelled like old coffee and paper. So was in his late 50s, a career cop with gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same red stone as the Mesa country. He'd been Ray's supervisor for the past 4 years, and Ray respected him, trusted him, but the look on So's face when Ray walked into the office told him that trust was about to be tested. So gestured to the chair across from his desk, and Ray sat down, waiting. So picked up a printed copy of Ray's incident report and tapped it with one finger. "I read this 3 times last night," he said, "and I'm still not sure what to make of it." Ray met his gaze and said, "It's what happened." So nodded slowly. "I believe you believe that, but you have to understand how this looks. You're telling me you encountered some kind of... What, exactly? A person? Something else?" Ray leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "I don't know what it was. I know what I saw, and I know it attacked me. I fired my weapon at it, and it didn't stop. It moved faster than anything I've ever seen, and then it just disappeared." Zoe set the report down on his desk and rubbed his face with both hands. "Did you hit your head during the encounter? You wrote that you fell and struck your head on the ground." Ray nodded. "I did, but I know what I saw. It happened before I hit my head, not after." Zoe sighed. "Look, Ray, I'm not saying you're lying. I'm not even saying you're wrong. But we have to be careful with this. Claire Atwood is in the hospital right now with a broken leg and a serious head injury, and we need to figure out what happened to her. If we start throwing around stories about mysterious figures with glowing eyes, it's going to make us look like a bunch of idiots. The FBI is going to want to know why we didn't secure the scene properly, why we didn't call for backup sooner, and if they think we're making excuses or covering up some kind of officer-involved incident, this whole thing is going to blow up in our faces." Ray felt his jaw tighten. "You think I hurt her? You think I'm covering something up?" Zoe held up a hand. "I didn't say that. But we have to consider all possibilities. Right now, all we know is that Claire Atwood went missing. You found her injured in a remote canyon, and you claim you were attacked by an unknown assailant who then vanished. We have no physical evidence of this assailant, no witnesses, nothing. Just your word." Ray stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "My word should be enough. I've been doing this job for 8 years, Captain. I've never lied in a report, never covered anything up. If you don't believe me, then I don't know what else to tell you." Zoe looked at him for a long moment, and then he nodded. "I do believe you, Ray, but believing you and being able to do something about it are 2 different things. For now, I'm going to have you sit this one out. I'm assigning the Atwood case to Officer Nez, and I want you to take a few days off, clear your head, maybe see a doctor and get checked out. If you hit your head hard enough, you might have a concussion, and that could explain some of what you experienced." Ray wanted to argue, wanted to tell Zoe that he was fine, that he didn't need time off, but he could see in the captain's eyes that it wasn't a request. It was an order. He nodded stiffly and said, "Fine, I'll take a few days." Zoe stood up and walked around the desk, putting a hand on Ray's shoulder. "This isn't a punishment, Ray. I just need to make sure everything is handled by the book. Take care of yourself, and when you come back, we'll figure out what the next steps are." Ray left the office without another word, walked through the squad room ignoring the looks from the other officers, and headed out to his vehicle. He sat behind the wheel for a few minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, and then he started the engine and drove. He didn't know where he was going at first, just drove aimlessly through town, past the trading post and the chapter house, and the small cluster of buildings that made up downtown Shiprock. Eventually, he found himself heading north again, back toward the mesa, and he realized that some part of him needed to go back there, needed to see the place in daylight, needed to prove to himself that what he'd experienced had been real. He reached the turnoff and followed the dirt road to the base of the mesa, parking his unit in the same spot he'd parked the night before. Claire's Explorer was gone, probably towed to the impound yard, and in the bright morning light the landscape looked completely different. The red rock glowed in the sunlight. The sky was a brilliant blue, and there was nothing threatening or ominous about the place. It looked like what it was: empty desert. Beautiful and harsh and indifferent. Ray got out of his vehicle and started walking toward the arroyo, retracing his steps from the night before. The boot prints were still there in the sand, his and Claire's, a record of their passage, and he followed them into the canyon. The walls rose up around him, blocking out the sun, and the temperature dropped noticeably. He walked slowly, his hand resting on his sidearm out of habit, and when he reached the spot where he'd found Claire, he stopped and looked around. The blood was still there, dark stains on the boulder and in the dirt, and he could see the drag marks leading away from it, just as he remembered. But there was something else. Something he hadn't noticed in the darkness. There were more symbols scratched into the rock face of the canyon wall, crude markings that looked similar to the ones on the rock cairns. Ray approached them slowly, running his fingers over the lines, and he realized they weren't random. They formed a pattern, a design that looked almost like a map, with lines radiating out from a central point. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures, zooming in to capture the details, and then he continued deeper into the canyon, following the path he'd taken the night before. He reached the spot where the figure had appeared, where it had attacked him, and he stopped, looking around carefully. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate that anyone else had been here. The ground was undisturbed, the rocks and brush exactly as they should be, and for a moment Ray felt a cold wave of doubt wash over him. Had he imagined it? Had the stress and the adrenaline and the blow to his head created some kind of hallucination? But then he looked down and saw his flashlight still lying where it had fallen during the fight, and he knew that at least some of what he remembered was real. He picked it up, checked to make sure it still worked, and then he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the humming sound, the same low vibration he'd heard the night before, and it was coming from deeper in the canyon. Ray stood there for a moment, every instinct telling him to turn around and leave, to get back in his vehicle and drive away and never come back. But he'd been a cop for too long to listen to those instincts, and besides, he needed answers. He needed to know what was out here, what had attacked him, what had hurt Claire. So he drew his sidearm, held it low and ready, and started walking toward the sound. The humming grew louder as he went deeper into the canyon, the walls narrowing around him until they were barely 20 feet apart. The light was dim here, the sun blocked by the high walls, and Ray had to use his flashlight to see where he was going. The canyon floor was littered with fallen rocks and debris, and he had to pick his way carefully, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. He rounded a bend and found himself standing at the entrance to a narrow slot canyon, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The humming sound was coming from inside, resonating off the walls, and Ray hesitated. Going into a space that confined was dangerous, especially alone, especially without backup. If something went wrong, if he got stuck, or if someone was waiting for him on the other side, there would be no way out. But the sound was so loud now, so insistent, that he couldn't ignore it. He holstered his weapon, turned his body sideways, and squeezed into the slot canyon. The walls pressed in on him from both sides, rough stone scraping against his shoulders, and he had to move slowly, carefully, his breathing echoing in the confined space. The passage went on for maybe 30 feet, twisting and turning, and then suddenly it opened up into a small circular chamber about 20 feet across. Ray stepped into the chamber and stopped, his flashlight beam sweeping across the space, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The walls of the chamber were covered in symbols, hundreds of them, carved deep into the rock, and in the center of the chamber was a pile of objects that looked like offerings. There were pieces of clothing, jewelry, scraps of paper with writing on them, and other things that Ray couldn't immediately identify. But what drew his attention, what made his breath catch in his throat, was the object sitting on top of the pile. It was a human skull, old and weathered, with more symbols carved into the bone. Ray approached it slowly, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't just some random collection of junk. This was a shrine, deliberately constructed, carefully maintained, and the humming sound was coming from it, vibrating through the air like a physical presence. Ray pulled out his phone and took pictures, documenting everything he could see, and then he noticed something else. There, partially buried under a piece of cloth, was a driver's license. He reached down carefully, using a pen from his pocket to move the cloth aside, and his heart sank when he saw the name on the license. It belonged to a woman named Sandra Key, and Ray recognized the name immediately. Sandra had gone missing 3 years ago, vanished without a trace while hiking in the Mesa country, and despite an extensive search, her body had never been found. The case had gone cold, one of dozens of unsolved missing persons cases on the reservation, and now Ray was looking at her license sitting in some kind of ritual chamber in the middle of nowhere. He stood up, his mind reeling, and that's when he heard footsteps behind him. Ray spun around, his hand going to his weapon, and there in the entrance to the chamber stood an old man. He was Navajo, probably in his 70s, with long gray hair and a weathered face, dressed in jeans and a faded denim shirt. He looked at Ray with the dark, knowing eyes and said, "You shouldn't be here, Officer Yazzie." Ray kept his hand on his weapon, but didn't draw it. "Who are you? What is this place?" The old man stepped into the chamber, moving slowly, his eyes never leaving Ray's face. "My name is Thomas Begay," he said, "and this place is a warning, a boundary that should not be crossed." Ray's mind was spinning. He'd heard the name Thomas Begay before, but he couldn't immediately place it. "Are you responsible for this? Did you hurt Claire Atwood?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "I didn't hurt her, but I knew she was in danger the moment she crossed into this canyon, just as you are in danger now." Ray felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about? What danger?" Thomas looked around the chamber, his gaze lingering on the skull and the symbols carved into the walls. "There are things in this world, Officer Yazzie, that your training didn't prepare you for. Old things that were here long before the white man came, long before even our people came. Things that live in the spaces between, that watch and wait and sometimes take what they want. This place is one of their hunting grounds, and the symbols you see here are meant to keep them contained, to mark the boundaries they cannot cross. But someone has been breaking those boundaries, moving the markers, weakening the protections, and now the old things are waking up." Ray stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. It sounded like superstition, like the kind of old stories his grandmother used to tell him when he was a child. Stories about skinwalkers and evil spirits and things that walked in the dark. But Ray was a cop, a man of facts and evidence, and he didn't believe in that kind of thing. Except that he'd seen something in this canyon the night before. Something that had moved faster than anything human. Something with eyes that glowed in the dark. "You're saying that thing I saw last night, that attacked me, that's one of these old things?" Thomas nodded. It is. And it marked you, Officer Yazzie. It knows you now, knows your scent, your face. It will come for you again, unless you do something to protect yourself. Ray felt his patience wearing thin. This is insane. I need answers. Real answers, not ghost stories. If you know something about what happened to Claire Atwood, about what happened to Sandra Key, and all the other people who've gone missing out here, you need to tell me right now. Thomas looked at him with something that might have been pity. I've been tracking these disappearances for 20 years, Officer Yazzie. I've found 12 bodies, maybe more, all of them taken by the old things. The police never listen, never believe, and so the bodies pile up and the old things grow stronger. You can dismiss what I'm telling you as superstition if you want, but deep down you know the truth. You felt it last night when that thing had its hands around your throat. You felt how strong it was, how wrong it was. You know it wasn't human. Ray wanted to argue, wanted to tell Thomas he was wrong, but the words died in his throat because he knew the old man was right. Whatever he'd encountered in that canyon, it hadn't been human. It had been something else, something that defied explanation, and the realization of that made him feel more afraid than he'd ever been in his life. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He held it out to Ray and said, "Take this. Keep it with you. It won't stop the old things, but it will give you some protection, make it harder for them to find you." Ray looked at the offered object and said, "What is it?" Thomas unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small stone pendant carved with symbols similar to the ones Ray had seen throughout the canyon. "It's a ward, made by my grandfather's grandfather. It's been in my family for generations, passed down to those who hunt the old things. You'll need it more than I do now." Ray hesitated, and then he reached out and took the pendant. It was cold to the touch, smooth and heavy in his palm, and the moment he closed his fingers around it, the humming sound in the chamber suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, and Ray looked up at Thomas with wide eyes. "What just happened?" Thomas smiled, a thin, tired smile. "The old things don't like those symbols. They burn them, repel them. As long as you carry that, they'll keep their distance. But Officer Yazzie, you need to understand something. The old things are patient. They can wait years, decades even, for the right moment. And when that moment comes, no ward, no protection, will save you if you're not prepared." Ray slipped the pendant into his pocket and said, "How do I prepare? How do I stop this?" Thomas shook his head. "You can't stop it. None of us can. All we can do is try to contain it, to keep it from spreading. The symbols, the cairns, the boundaries, they're all meant to keep the old things confined to certain areas, to keep them from wandering freely. But someone has been moving the markers, breaking the protections, and I don't know why. Until we find out who and stop them, the disappearances will continue." Ray felt a surge of frustration. "Then help me. Show me where the markers are. Tell me what to look for. If someone's moving them, there has to be evidence, tracks, something we can use to identify them." Thomas considered this for a moment, and then he nodded. "I'll show you. But you have to promise me something, Officer Yazzie. Whatever you see, whatever you learn, you cannot tell your superiors everything. They won't believe you, and they'll have you removed from the force, labeled as unstable. You have to work within the system, but you also have to work outside it. Do you understand?" Ray didn't like it. Didn't like the idea of keeping secrets or working behind his captain's back, but he also knew that Thomas was right. If he went back to the station and told Captain So about shrines and old things and protective wards, he'd be laughed out of the building or sent for a psychiatric evaluation. So he nodded and said, "I understand. Show me." Thomas led him out of the chamber, back through the slot canyon, and out into the main canyon. They walked together in silence, the old man moving with a surprising agility for his age, and Ray followed, his mind full of questions. They climbed out of the canyon and onto the mesa, and Thomas led him to the line of rock cairns that Ray had discovered the night before. "These are the markers," Thomas said, kneeling beside one of the cairns. "Each one marks a boundary point, a place where the protections are strongest. There are dozens of them scattered across the mesa, forming a network that contains the old things. But look here." He pointed to the cairn, and Ray could see that some of the rocks had been disturbed, moved slightly out of alignment. Someone has been tampering with them, weakening the protections. If enough of them are damaged, the boundaries will fail completely, and the old things will be free to roam wherever they want. Ray knelt beside Thomas, examining the cairn more closely. "How can you tell it was tampered with? Maybe it was just the wind, or animals." Thomas shook his head. "The wind doesn't move rocks this size, and animals don't disturb them in this pattern. Someone did this deliberately, someone who knows what these markers are and what they're protecting. And that person is very dangerous, Officer Yazzie, because they're either trying to release the old things intentionally, or they're too ignorant to understand what they're doing." Ray stood up, looking out across the mesa at the other cairns scattered across the landscape. "If someone's moving these markers, they had to come out here, probably multiple times. That means there might be vehicle tracks, footprints, maybe even surveillance footage from traffic cameras or gas stations. I can work that angle, try to identify who's been coming out here." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's good. Use your skills, your training, but remember what I told you. The old things are real, and they are watching. Be careful, Officer Yazzie." Ray looked at the old man and said, "Why are you telling me all this? Why now?" Thomas stood up slowly, brushing the dust from his knees, and looked out toward the distant horizon where Shiprock rose like a jagged tooth against the sky. "Because I'm old, and I'm tired, and I can't do this alone anymore. For 20 years I've been trying to keep the boundaries intact, trying to keep the old things contained, and I've failed. People keep disappearing, and no one believes me when I try to warn them. But you, Officer Yazzie, you've seen them now. You've felt their touch. You know the truth, and that means you can help me. Together, maybe we can stop whoever is breaking the protections before it's too late." Ray felt the weight of what Thomas was asking settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd become a cop to help people, to protect his community, and now he was being told that there was a threat out here that was beyond anything he'd been trained to handle. A threat that existed in the shadows, and the old stories and the spaces between reality and nightmare. But he'd also seen that threat firsthand, had felt its hands around his throat, and he knew he couldn't walk away. "All right," he said finally. "I'll help you, but we do this my way. We gather evidence, we build a case, and we find whoever is doing this. And if these old things are real, if they're really out here hurting people, then we find a way to stop them, too." Thomas smiled, and for the first time, Ray saw something like hope in the old man's eyes. "Then we have work to do, Officer Yazzie. Come, I'll show you the other markers, and we'll see which ones have been disturbed." They spent the next 3 hours walking the mesa, checking each cairn, documenting which ones had been tampered with and which ones were still intact. Ray took photographs, made notes, and tried to look for any pattern in the disturbances. By the time they finished, the sun was high overhead, and Ray's shirt was soaked with sweat. They'd found 7 cairns that had been damaged, all of them clustered in the northern section of the mesa, and Ray marked their locations on his phone's GPS. "This is enough to start with," he said, showing Thomas the map. If someone's targeting these specific markers, there has to be a reason. Maybe they're trying to open up a specific area, or maybe they're just working systematically. Either way, it gives us something to work with. Thomas nodded. What will you do now? Ray thought for a moment. First, I'm going to check the hospital, see if Claire Atwood has woken up yet. If she has, I need to talk to her, find out what she remembers. Then, I'm going to start pulling traffic camera footage, see if I can identify any vehicles that have been out here repeatedly. And I'm going to do some research, look into the history of this area, see if there are any records of similar incidents or disappearances. Thomas reached out and gripped Ray's shoulder, his hand strong despite his age. Be careful, Officer Yazzie. Whoever is doing this, they are dangerous. And the old things, they will be watching you now. They know you're hunting them. Ray met his gaze and nodded. I'll be careful, and Thomas, thank you for trusting me with this. The old man released his shoulder and turned away, starting back toward the edge of the mesa. Ray watched him go, a solitary figure walking across the red stone, and then he turned and headed back toward his vehicle. As he drove back toward the town, the pendant Thomas had given him heavy in his pocket, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed some kind of threshold, that his life had changed in some fundamental way. He'd spent 8 years as a cop dealing with drunk drivers and domestic disputes and the occasional burglary, and now he was hunting something that defied explanation, something that existed in the realm of nightmares and old stories. But he'd made a promise and he intended to keep it. He reached the hospital just after 2 in the afternoon and found Claire Atwood's room on the 2nd floor. She was awake, propped up in bed with her left leg in a cast and a bandage wrapped around her head. She looked pale and tired, but when she saw Ray standing in the doorway, she managed a weak smile. Officer Yazzie, she said, her voice hoarse, they told me you're the one who found me. Ray stepped into the room and pulled up a chair beside her bed. I am. How are you feeling? Claire touched the bandage on her head gingerly. Like I got hit by a truck. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive. They said if you hadn't found me when you did, I probably would have bled out or died from exposure. Ray nodded. I need to ask you some questions, if you're up to it. About what happened out there. Claire's expression darkened, and she looked away, staring at the wall. I don't really remember much. I was taking pictures, following the trail, and then... I don't know. I remember falling, hitting my head, and then everything is just... fragments. Flashes of images, sounds, but nothing coherent. Ray leaned forward. Do you remember seeing anyone else out there? Anyone at all? Claire was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, there was someone, I think. A man, maybe? I remember feeling like I was being watched, like someone was following me, and then... I don't know, it's all so confused. Ray pulled out his phone and showed her the pictures he'd taken of the symbols carved into the canyon walls. Do you recognize these? Did you see them while you were out there? Claire looked at the images, her brow furrowing, and then she shook her head. I don't think so. What are they? Ray slipped his phone back into his pocket. I'm not sure yet, but I think they might be connected to what happened to you. Claire looked at him, and Ray could see the fear in her eyes. Do you think someone did this to me deliberately? That it wasn't just an accident? Ray wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but he couldn't lie to her. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Ray left the hospital just after 3 and drove straight to the tribal police station, his mind churning with everything he'd learned. Captain So had told him to take time off, but Ray couldn't sit idle, not when there was work to be done, not when people were disappearing and something was hunting in the Mesa country. He parked in the lot behind the station and walked in through the back entrance. hoping to avoid running into So or any of the other officers who might ask questions about why he wasn't at home resting. The station was quiet in the afternoon, most of the day shift out on patrol, and Ray made his way to the records room without being stopped. He needed to do research, needed to understand the history of disappearances in the area, and the best place to start was with the department's own files. The records room was a cramped space in the basement, lined with filing cabinets and boxes of old case files that hadn't been digitized yet. Ray flipped on the lights and started searching, pulling files on missing persons cases going back 20 years. There were more than he'd expected, dozens of them. People who had vanished without a trace in the Mesa country and the surrounding areas. Some were hikers, some were locals, some were tourists passing through, but the pattern was clear. People went into that wilderness and they didn't come out. Ray spread the files across a table and started making notes, looking for connections, for anything that might tell him what was happening out there. Most of the cases had gone cold within weeks, the searches turning up nothing, no bodies, no evidence, just empty desert and unanswered questions. He found Sandra Key's file and pulled it, reading through the incident reports and witness statements. She'd been 24 when she disappeared, a graduate student studying geology at the University of New Mexico, out hiking alone to collect rock samples for her thesis. Her car had been found at the same spot where Claire Atwood's vehicle had been discovered, and the search teams had combed the mesa for days without finding any trace of her. The case had eventually been closed, marked as a probable accidental death, exposure or a fall, body never recovered. But Ray knew better now. He'd seen her driver's license in that chamber, mixed in with the offerings and the symbols and the skull, and he knew she hadn't died from exposure. She'd been taken, just like the others, and her body was probably buried somewhere out there in the desert. Food for the old things that Thomas Begay had warned him about. Ray pulled more files, going further back, and he found a pattern that made his blood run cold. Every 3 or 4 years, there was a cluster of disappearances. Sometimes 2 or 3 within a few months of each other, and then things would go quiet again for a while. It was like whatever was out there was feeding, taking what it needed, and then going dormant until it was hungry again. And now, with Claire Atwood's attack, and the damaged cairns that Thomas had shown him, it looked like a new cycle was starting. Ray photographed the relevant pages from the files with his phone, careful to document everything, and then he started looking for anything that might tell him who had been out in the Mesa country around the times of the disappearances. Traffic citations, incident reports, anything that might give him a lead. He was so focused on the files that he didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. The door to the records room opened, and Captain Franklin So walked in, his expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "Yazzie," he said, his voice hard. "What are you doing here? I told you to take time off." Ray straightened up, meeting his captain's gaze. "I'm following up on the Atwood case. There are things in these files that connect to what happened to her, patterns that suggest—" Zoe held up a hand, cutting him off. "I don't want to hear it. I gave you an order, and you're disobeying it. That's not like you, Ray." Ray felt his frustration boiling over. "Captain, there's something going on out there. People have been disappearing from the mesa for years, and nobody's been connecting the dots. I found evidence today that—" Zoe's expression darkened. "Evidence of what? Ghost stories? Ancient curses? I read your report, Ray, and I know what you think you saw out there, but we deal in facts, not superstition. Now I'm telling you one more time. Go home, rest, and when you come back we'll talk about your future with this department." The words hit Ray like a physical blow. "My future? You're threatening my job?" Zoe's voice softened slightly. "I'm not threatening anything. I'm trying to help you. You've been a good officer, Ray, but you're not acting like yourself. You got hit in the head, you had a traumatic experience, and you need time to process it. That's not weakness, that's just being human. But if you keep pushing this, if you keep pursuing leads based on nothing but old stories and your own imagination, then yes, we're going to have a problem. Ray wanted to argue, wanted to show Tso the photographs, the connections he'd found in the files, but he could see it would be pointless. The captain had already made up his mind, had already decided that Ray was suffering from some kind of stress-induced delusion, and nothing Ray said would change that. So he nodded, gathered up his notes, and said, "Fine, I'll go home." So watched him leave, and Ray could feel the captain's eyes on his back as he climbed the stairs and walked out of the station. But Ray had no intention of going home. He had work to do, and if he had to do it without the department's support, then so be it. He got into his unit and drove, heading toward the eastern edge of town where Thomas Begay had said he lived. Ray found the address after asking directions from an elderly woman working at a roadside fruit stand. It was a small trailer set back from the road, surrounded by scrub brush and a chain-link fence. An old pickup truck was parked in front, covered in dust, and as Ray pulled up he saw Thomas sitting on the front steps, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. The old man looked up as Ray approached and nodded, as if he'd been expecting him. "Captain didn't believe you," Thomas said, more a statement than a question. Ray shook his head. "No, he thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. He's threatening to take me off active duty if I don't drop this." Thomas took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out slowly. "I told you they wouldn't believe. The old things, they've survived this long because people refuse to see them, refuse to accept that they're real. It's easier to dismiss the truth as superstition than to face what's really out there." Ray sat down on the steps beside Thomas, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. He hadn't slept properly in 2 days. His body was aching from the climb and the fight, and his head was pounding from the stress of it all. "I found the files," he said, "going back 20 years, dozens of missing persons, all from the Mesa country, all unsolved. The pattern is there, clear as day, but nobody's put it together. Or if they have, they've buried it." Thomas nodded. "I've tried to tell them. Every time someone goes missing, I go to the police. I show them the evidence, but they don't listen. They think I'm just a crazy old man telling ghost stories. But you've seen it now, Officer Yazzie. You know the truth." Ray pulled out his phone and showed Thomas the photographs he'd taken from the case files. "These are the disappearances. I marked them on a map, and they all cluster in the same area, the northern mesa near where I found Claire. If we can figure out who's been tampering with the cairns, we might be able to stop the next disappearance before it happens." Thomas studied the photographs, his weathered face thoughtful. "The old things, they have patterns. They hunt in cycles, taking what they need and then resting. But someone is feeding them, keeping them strong, moving the markers to give them more hunting ground. We need to find that person, and we need to stop them." Ray looked at the old man. "You said you've been tracking this for 20 years. Have you ever found anything that might tell us who's behind it? Any witnesses? Any evidence?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There was one. A man named Hosteen, worked as a maintenance supervisor for the BLM. He used to patrol the Mesa country, checking on the roads and the markers. About 5 years ago, he told me he'd seen someone out there at night, moving the cairns, performing some kind of ritual. He tried to confront them, and 2 days later he was found dead in his trailer. Official cause of death was heart attack, but I knew better. The old things got to him." Ray felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think this person Hosteen saw is still out there? Still moving the markers?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I do, and I think they're getting bolder. The number of damaged cairns has increased over the past year. and the old things are becoming more active. It's only a matter of time before they take someone else. Ray stood up, his mind made up. Then we need to set a trap. If this person is going out to the mesa regularly to move the markers, we can stake out the area, catch them in the act. I can use my department access to pull traffic camera footage, see if there's a vehicle that shows up repeatedly on the roads leading to the mesa. Once we have a pattern, we can predict when they'll come back and be waiting for them. Thomas looked up at him, a hint of approval in his dark eyes. That's good thinking. But Officer Yazzie, you need to understand something. Whoever this person is, they're not doing this for money or power or any of the usual reasons. They're doing it because they serve the old things, because they've made some kind of pact. That makes them very dangerous, and it means they won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way. Are you prepared for that? Ray met his gaze and nodded. I am, but I'm not going in alone. I need you with me, Thomas. You know the mesa, you know the old things, and I need that knowledge if we're going to survive this. Thomas smiled, a thin, tired smile, and stood up. All right, Officer Yazzie. We'll work together. But first, we need to gather more information. There's someone else you should talk to, someone who might be able to help us. Ray followed Thomas into the trailer, a cramped space that smelled of tobacco and old paper. The walls were covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs, all of them documenting the disappearances and the old things. Ray scanned the materials, his eyes widening as he took in the scope of Thomas's research. This wasn't the work of a crazy old man. This was the work of someone who had devoted years of his life to understanding a threat that nobody else would acknowledge. Thomas rummaged through a stack of papers on a cluttered desk and pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age. He handed it to Ray, and Ray found himself looking at a black and white image of a young woman standing in front of the mesa. She was smiling, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked happy, carefree. Who is this? Ray asked. Thomas's expression softened. Her name was Emma Atcity. She was my granddaughter. She disappeared 15 years ago, out in the Mesa country. She was the reason I started tracking the old things, the reason I've spent the last 20 years trying to stop them. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save someone else. Ray felt a surge of sympathy for the old man. He handed the photograph back and said, I'm sorry, I didn't know. Thomas tucked the photograph back into the stack of papers and said, Most people don't. But it's why I do this work, why I can't let it go. Now come, there's someone we need to visit. Her name is Helen Lowry, and she lives out near the Bisty Badlands. She's a medicine woman, one of the few left who still knows the old ways. If anyone can help us understand what we're dealing with, it's her. They took Ray's unit, driving west out of Shiprock toward the Bisty Badlands, a surreal landscape of hoodoos and wind-carved rock formations that looked like something from another planet. The drive took almost an hour, the road getting rougher as they left the paved highway and followed dirt tracks deeper into the wilderness. Thomas directed Ray through a series of turns, navigating by memory and instinct, and finally they arrived at a small hogan set in a hollow between two ridges. Smoke was rising from a hole in the roof, and as Ray parked the vehicle, he could hear the sound of chanting coming from inside. Thomas got out and walked toward the hogan, calling out in Navajo, and a moment later an elderly woman emerged. She was small and wiry, her hair white as snow, her face so deeply lined it looked like a map of the desert itself. Thomas spoke to her in Navajo, too quickly for Ray to follow, and the woman's eyes moved to Ray, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. She said something to Thomas, and he nodded, turning to Ray. Helen says she's been expecting us. She says the old things have been restless, that the boundaries are failing. She wants to know if you're the one who encountered them in the canyon. Ray nodded. I am. I was attacked, and I found evidence that someone has been tampering with the protective cairns. We need to know how to stop them, how to protect people. Helen stepped closer, and Ray could smell sage and tobacco on her clothes. She reached out and took his hand, turning it over to look at his palm, and then she said something in Navajo that made Thomas's expression darken. What did she say? Ray asked. Thomas hesitated, and then said, She says you've been marked. The old things have claimed you as prey, and they will hunt you until you're dead or until they are destroyed. She says the ward I gave you will only protect you for a short time, and that you need to undergo a cleansing ceremony if you want to survive. Ray felt his stomach tighten. A ceremony? What kind of ceremony? Helen spoke again, this time in heavily accented English. Enemy way ceremony. It removes the contamination of contact with the dead, with evil spirits. It takes 4 days, and it requires family, community. Without it, the old things will find you no matter where you hide. Ray shook his head. I don't have 4 days. People are disappearing, and we need to stop whoever is feeding the old things before someone else gets hurt. Helen's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or fear. If you do not cleanse yourself, you will die. The old things do not give up their prey easily. They will come for you in your dreams, in the shadows, when you are alone and vulnerable. The ward will slow them, but it will not stop them. Ray looked at Thomas, who nodded gravely. She's right, Officer Yazzie. I've seen what happens to people who are marked by the old things. They waste away, consumed by fear and nightmares until they take their own lives or simply disappear. If you want to survive this, you need to do the ceremony. Ray felt trapped, caught between the need to act and the need to protect himself. But he thought about Claire Atwood lying in that hospital bed, about Sandra Key and Emma Atcity and all the others who had been taken, and he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Then we'll do the ceremony, he said, but after we catch whoever is tampering with the cairns. I can't just sit idle for 4 days knowing that someone else might disappear. Helen looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded slowly. You are brave, but you are also foolish. The old things do not care about your sense of duty. They will take you when they are ready, ceremony or no ceremony. But I will help you in the meantime. I will give you protection, stronger than the ward Thomas gave you, but it will come at a cost. Ray met her gaze. What cost? Helen turned and walked back toward the T. Hogan, gesturing for Ray and Thomas to follow. Inside, the space was dim and smoky, lit by a small fire burning in the center. The walls were hung with bundles of dried herbs and animal pelts, and Ray could see ritual objects arranged on a small altar in the corner. Helen moved to the altar and began gathering items. A small clay bowl, a bundle of sage, a black stone that looked like obsidian. She worked in silence, her movements precise and deliberate, and Ray watched, feeling like he was witnessing something ancient and powerful. When she was finished, she turned to Ray and said, "Give me your hand." Ray extended his hand, and Helen took it, turning his palm up. She picked up the black stone and pressed it against his palm, and Ray felt a sudden sharp pain, like the stone was burning his skin. He tried to pull away, but Helen's grip was iron, holding him in place as she chanted in Navajo, the words rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. The pain intensified, spreading up his arm, and Ray gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to cry out. After what felt like an eternity, Helen released his hand, and Ray looked down to see a symbol burned into his palm, a circular design similar to the ones he'd seen carved into the rocks on the mesa. The skin around it was red and inflamed, but the symbol itself was black as coal. "This will protect you," Helen said, her voice hoarse from the chanting. but only for a time. The old things will sense it, and they will try to break through. When that happens, you will feel pain, and you will know they are close. You must not ignore it. You must not let them get near you. Ray flexed his hand, feeling the ache in his palm, and nodded. Thank you. What's the cost you mentioned? Helen's expression was grim. The cost is that you are now bound to this place, to the mesa and the old things. You cannot leave, cannot run until this is finished. If you try to flee, the protection will fail, and you will die. Do you understand? Ray felt the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. He was trapped now, bound to this fight whether he wanted to be or not. But he'd known from the moment he'd stepped into that canyon, from the moment he'd felt those hands around his throat, that there was no going back. I understand, he said. Helen nodded and turned to Thomas. You must keep him safe. The old things will come for him, and when they do, you must be ready. Gather the others, those who still remember the old ways. We will need their strength if we are to survive what is coming. Thomas bowed his head respectfully. I will, Helen. Thank you for your help. They left the Hogan and drove back toward the Shiprock in silence, the sun setting behind them and casting long shadows across the desert. Ray's hand throbbed with pain, but he ignored it. His mind focused on the task ahead. As they reached the outskirts of town, Ray's phone buzzed with a notification. He pulled it out and saw a message from the department's IT specialist, someone Ray had called earlier to request access to traffic camera footage from the roads leading to the mesa. The message was brief. Got the footage you requested. Some interesting patterns. Call me. Ray showed the message to Thomas, who nodded. It's starting. We're getting closer. Ray pulled over and dialed the IT specialist's number. The man answered on the second ring. Yazzie, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. I pulled the footage like you asked, and there's definitely something weird going on. There's a vehicle that shows up on the cameras at least once a week, always late at night, always heading toward the mesa. It's an old Chevy truck, white. Looks like it's from the 80s or 90s. I ran the plates, and they come back registered to a guy named Dale Key, lives over in Farmington. Ray felt his heart skip a beat. Key? As in Sandra Key? The IT specialist paused. Yeah, actually. I checked the file. Dale Key is listed as Sandra Key's father. Why? Is that relevant? Ray's mind was racing. Very relevant. Send me everything you have on Dale Key. Address, phone number, vehicle registration, everything. The specialist agreed, and Ray hung up, looking at Thomas. It's her father, Sandra Key's father. He's the one who's been going out to the mesa, tampering with the cairns. Thomas's expression was dark. That makes sense. If his daughter was taken by the old things, he might blame himself, might think he can bring her back by serving them. It's a kind of madness, but I've seen it before. People who lose someone to the old things, they'll do anything to get them back, even if it means feeding the monster. Ray started the engine and pulled back onto the road, heading toward Farmington. We need to confront him, find out what he knows. If he's been serving the old things, he might be able to tell us how to stop them. Thomas nodded. But be careful, Officer Yazzie. If he's made a pact with the old things, he's not going to give up easily. He might see us as a threat, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect what he's built. Ray's hand throbbed, the symbol Helen had burned into his palm pulsing with heat, and he knew she was right. The old things were close, watching, waiting, and the fight was just beginning. They reached Farmington just after 8, the town's lights glowing against the dark sky. Ray found Dale Key's address in the IT specialist's file, a small house on the edge of town near the river. The house was dark, no lights in the windows, and Dale's white Chevy truck was parked in the driveway. Ray parked down the street, far enough away to avoid being spotted, and he and Thomas sat there for a moment, watching the house. "What's the plan?" Thomas asked. Ray checked his sidearm, making sure it was loaded. "We knock on the door, we ask him some questions. If he cooperates, great. If he doesn't, I'll arrest him for interfering with the police investigation. Either way, we're going to get answers." Thomas nodded, and they got out of the vehicle, walking toward the house. As they approached, Ray noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible between the door and the frame. Ray held up a hand, signaling Thomas to stop, and he drew his weapon. "Mr. Key?" he called out. "This is Officer Yazzie with the Navajo Tribal Police. I need to speak with you." There was no response, just silence, and Ray felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He pushed the door open slowly, his weapon leading the way, and stepped inside. The house was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else, something rotten. Ray flipped on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The walls were covered in symbols, the same ones he'd seen in the canyon, scratched into the plaster with something sharp. And in the center of the room, lying on the floor, was Dale Key. He was dead, his throat cut, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, and his hands were clutched around a piece of paper. Ray approached the body carefully, his heart pounding, and knelt down beside it. He pried the paper from Dale's fingers and unfolded it, shining his flashlight on the words scrawled across the surface. The writing was shaky, frantic, and the message was clear. "They want more. I can't give them more. God forgive me." Ray stood up, the paper trembling in his hand, and looked at Thomas. "He's dead. Someone got to him before we did." Thomas stepped into the house, his face grim, and looked around at the symbols on the walls. Or something got to him. The old things, they don't like to be betrayed. If Dale tried to stop feeding them, if he tried to break his pact, they would have come for him. This is their work. Ray felt the symbol on his palm burn, a sharp, searing pain that made him gasp. He looked down and saw the mark glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. "Thomas," he said, his voice tight, "they're here." Thomas turned, his eyes widening, and that's when Ray heard it. The humming sound, the same low vibration he'd heard in the canyon, filling the air, resonating through the walls. And then, from somewhere in the back of the house, he heard footsteps. Ray's weapon was up and trained on the hallway before his conscious mind had even processed the threat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing through the empty house like a drumbeat. Thomas moved to Ray's side, his weathered face tense, and Ray could see the old man reaching into his jacket pocket for something. The humming sound grew louder, filling Ray's head until it felt like his skull might split open, and the symbol on his palm burned with an intensity that made his hand shake. "Get behind me," Ray whispered to Thomas, but the old man shook his head. "We face this together, Officer Yazzie. Whatever comes through that door, we face it together." The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence, heavy and oppressive. Ray's finger tightened on the trigger, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Then a figure stepped into the beam of his flashlight, and Ray's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, or at least it had been once. She was tall and thin, her skin pale as moonlight, her hair long and black and matted with dirt. But it was her eyes that made Ray's blood run cold. They were empty, hollow, reflecting his flashlight beam like mirrors, and when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice was like wind scraping across stone. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, and Ray recognized the voice. It was the same one he'd heard in the canyon, the same inhuman tone that had promised him death. Ray kept his weapon steady, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "Identify yourself. Are you with the Farmington police?" The woman tilted her head, studying him with those empty eyes, and then she laughed, a sound that made the walls seem to vibrate. "I am no one. I am everyone who has been taken, everyone who has been fed to the hunger. Dale Key opened the door, and now I walk." Thomas stepped forward, his hand emerging from his pocket clutching a small bundle of sage, tied with red thread. "You are not welcome here," he said in Navajo, his voice strong and clear. "This is not your world. Return to the spaces between. Return to the darkness that spawned you." The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too many. "The old tracker, Thomas Begay, who lost his granddaughter to the hunger. Do you think your words have power? Do you think your sage and your prayers can stop what has been awakened?" Ray felt his hand burning, the symbol pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, and he realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just some human servant of the old things. This was one of them, wearing human skin like a costume, using a body it had taken from someone who had wandered too far into the mesa. "Where is she?" Ray demanded. "Where's the person you're wearing?" The woman turned her attention back to Ray, and he could feel the weight of her gaze like physical pressure. "She is gone. Consumed. Nothing but meat and memory. Just as you will be, Ray Yazzie, when the hunger takes you. Your protection will fail, your ward will crumble, and then you will understand what it means to be prey." Thomas moved suddenly, throwing the bundle of sage at the woman, and as it hit her chest it burst into flame, bright and hot and smelling of burning herbs. The woman shrieked, a sound that was nothing human, and stumbled backward, her skin smoking where the sage had touched her. Ray didn't hesitate. He fired 3 shots center mass, the reports deafening in the confined space, and the woman went down hard, collapsing to the floor. But even as she fell, Ray could see her skin beginning to change, to shift and ripple like water, and he knew with sick certainty that bullets wouldn't stop her for long. "We need to leave," Thomas said urgently, grabbing Ray's arm. "Now, before more of them come." They ran for the door, Ray's flashlight bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the house. Behind them, Ray could hear the woman rising, could hear that terrible humming sound growing louder, and then there were more voices joining the first, a chorus of inhuman sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They burst out the front door and into the night, and Ray didn't stop running until they reached his unit. He fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking, and finally got the door open. Thomas threw himself into the passenger seat, and Ray started the engine, throwing the vehicle into reverse and peeling out of the driveway. As they sped away, Ray looked in the rearview mirror and saw figures emerging from the house, tall and pale, and moving with that same unnatural speed he'd witnessed in the canyon. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, and they were giving chase. "They're following us," Ray said, his voice tight. Thomas twisted in his seat to look back. "Drive faster. Get us back to the mesa. That's where this started, and that's where it has to end." Ray pressed down on the accelerator, the unit's engine roaring as they flew through the darkened streets of Farmington and out onto the highway. The speedometer climbed past 80, then 90, but when Ray checked the mirror again, the figures were still there, running behind them with impossible speed, their pale forms visible in the red glow of his taillights. "They're not falling back," Ray said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "How fast can those things run?" Thomas didn't answer, just pulled out his phone and started making calls, speaking rapidly in Navajo to someone on the other end. The drive back to Shiprock took 20 minutes that felt like an eternity. Ray pushing the unit as hard as it would go while Thomas coordinated with whoever was on the phone. As they reached the outskirts of town, Thomas directed Ray to turn off onto a dirt road that led toward the mesa, and Ray could see lights ahead, vehicles parked in a rough circle with their headlights pointing inward. "What is this?" Ray asked. Thomas ended his call and said, "Help. I called everyone I could reach who still remembers the old ways, who still knows how to fight. They're here to make a stand." Ray pulled up to the circle of vehicles and killed the engine, and he and Thomas got out. There were maybe a dozen people there, mostly older Navajo men and women, some holding bundles of sage and cedar, others carrying what looked like drums and rattles. Helen Lowry was there, standing in the center of the circle, and she nodded to Ray as he approached. "The old things are coming," she said, her voice calm despite the gravity of her words. "They have been awakened, and they will not stop until they are fed or until they are destroyed. We must perform the ceremony now, before they arrive." Ray looked around at the assembled group, at these people who had come out in the middle of the night to fight something that most of the world refused to believe existed, and he felt a surge of gratitude and fear in equal measure. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Helen gestured to the center of the circle. "Stand there. We will form a barrier around you, a wall of protection that will hold the old things at bay long enough for us to perform the cleansing. But you must not move, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear. If you break the circle, the protection will fail." Ray moved to the center of the circle, and the others formed a ring around him. Their hands joined, their voices rising in a chant that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. Helen stepped forward and placed her hand on Ray's chest, directly over his heart, and he felt a wave of heat wash through him, starting at his core and radiating outward. The symbol on his palm blazed with light, so bright it hurt to look at, and Ray gasped at the intensity of it. "The old things marked you as prey," Helen said, her voice cutting through the chanting, "but we are marking you as protected, as one who belongs to the light and not the darkness. Hold fast, Ray Yazzie. This will hurt." And it did. The pain was like nothing Ray had ever experienced. Worse than being shot. Worse than being burned. It felt like every cell in his body was being torn apart and rebuilt, like fire was consuming him from the inside out. He wanted to scream, wanted to fall to his knees, but he forced himself to stay standing, to stay still, because he knew that the lives of everyone in this circle depended on him holding fast. The chanting grew louder, the voices harmonizing in a way that seemed impossible, and Ray could feel something shifting, something changing. The mark on his palm was fading, the black symbol burning away, replaced by something else, something that felt clean and whole. And then, from the darkness beyond the circle of vehicles, Ray heard them coming. The old things arrived like a storm, pale figures moving with that terrible speed, their voices raised in that inhuman humming that made his ears ring. They surrounded the circle, circling like wolves, and Ray could see their faces now, could see that some of them wore features he recognized from the missing persons files. There was Sandra Key, her blonde hair matted with dirt, her eyes empty and reflecting the light. There was Emma Atsity, Thomas's granddaughter, her young face twisted into something monstrous. And there were others, so many others, all of them taken by the hunger, all of them transformed into something that was no longer human. The old things threw themselves at the circle, and Ray could see an invisible barrier shimmer into existence as they hit it, could hear them shrieking in pain and rage as the protection held them back. But the barrier was weakening. Ray could feel it, could see the way it flickered and dimmed with each assault. Helen's hand pressed harder against his chest, and her voice rose above the chanting, speaking words in a language Ray didn't understand, words that felt ancient and powerful. The old things redoubled their efforts, clawing at the barrier, and Ray saw one of them break through, saw it stumble into the circle and reach for one of the chanters, an elderly man who stood at the northern point. Thomas moved faster than Ray would have thought possible, stepping between the old thing and the man, and he threw something into its face, a handful of ash that exploded into light when it made contact. The old thing screamed and fell back, its skin burning where the ash had touched it, and Thomas dragged the elderly man back into position, repairing the circle. "Hold the line," Thomas shouted. "Don't let them break through." The chanting intensified, the voices becoming one, and Ray felt the cleansing reach its peak. The last remnants of the mark burned away, replaced by a symbol of light that seemed to pulse with its own energy, and suddenly Ray understood what Helen had done. She hadn't just removed the old thing's claim on him. She'd made him into a weapon against them. "Now!" Helen shouted, and she pushed Ray forward, out of the circle and toward the old things. Ray stumbled, his hand blazing with light, and when the first of the old things lunged at him, he thrust his palm forward instinctively. The light from the symbol exploded outward, bright as the sun, and the old thing shrieked and disintegrated, its form crumbling into ash that was carried away on the wind. Ray stared at his hand in shock, and then another old thing was on him, and he struck out again, the light consuming it. One by one, Ray moved through the circle of old things, his hand blazing, and each one that he touched fell away, destroyed by the light that Helen had placed within him. But there were so many of them, and Ray could feel his strength flagging, could feel the light beginning to dim. He struck down Sandra Key's corrupted form, and then Emma Atsidy's, and each time he did it felt like he was killing them all over again, erasing the last remnants of who they had been. The old things began to retreat, pulling back into the darkness, and Ray pursued them, driven by something he couldn't name, something that demanded he see this through to the end. He chased them across the open ground, toward the mesa, and he could hear Thomas shouting behind him, telling him to stop, to come back, but Ray didn't listen. He had to end this, had to make sure the old things couldn't hurt anyone else. He reached the base of the mesa and started climbing, following the old things up the slope, and when he reached the top he found himself standing at the edge of the canyon where this had all started. The old things were there, clustered together, and Ray could see that they were different now, could see that the light had wounded them in some fundamental way. They were flickering, fading in and out of existence, like images on a broken television screen. Ray held up his hand, the symbol still glowing, and he said, "This ends now. You're not taking anyone else." The old things hissed and shrieked, but they didn't attack. Instead, they began to sink into the ground, melting into the earth like water, and Ray realized they were retreating, going back to wherever they had come from. But before they disappeared completely, one of them spoke, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You have won nothing, Ray Yazzie. We are eternal. We will always be here, in the spaces between, in the darkness that waits. And one day, when you are old and weak, and the light has faded, we will return for you." And then they were gone, vanished into the earth, leaving Ray standing alone on the mesa with the wind howling around him. He stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his hand still glowing faintly, and then he turned and started back down the slope. Thomas was waiting for him at the base of the mesa, along with Helen and the others. They looked exhausted, drained, but there was relief in their eyes. "Is it over?" Thomas asked. Ray nodded slowly. For now, they retreated, went back to wherever they came from, but they said they'd return. Helen stepped forward and examined Ray's hand, and he could see satisfaction in her weathered face. The cleansing worked. You are free of their mark, and you have become something they fear. But Officer Yazzie, you must understand that what they said is true. The old things are eternal, and they will always exist in the dark places of this world. Our victory today was not in destroying them, but in driving them back, in repairing the boundaries that keep them contained. Ray looked out across the mesa, at the distant shadow of Shiprock rising against the night sky, and he felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over him. He thought about Claire Atwood, recovering in the hospital, about Sandra Key and Emma Atcity, and all the others who had been taken, and he knew that their deaths hadn't been in vain. The old things had been pushed back, the boundaries had been restored, and for now, at least, people were safe. "What happens now?" he asked. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "Now we rebuild the cairns, we strengthen the protections, and we teach the next generation what we know. The fight against the old things is never truly over, but it can be managed, contained. And you, Officer Yazzie, you have a choice to make. You can return to your life, to your job with the police, and pretend that none of this ever happened. Or you can join us, become a guardian of the boundaries, and help ensure that the old things never break free again." Ray thought about Captain So, about the station and the reports, and the endless routine of police work. He thought about how he'd been threatened with losing his job just for investigating the truth, about how the department had refused to see what was really happening out here. And then he thought about the people gathered around him, these men and women who had risked their lives to fight something that most people would never believe existed. And he knew what his answer had to be. "I'll join you," he said. "But I'm not giving up my badge. I can do both. I can be a cop and a guardian. Maybe that's what this place needs, someone who can work in both worlds." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile this time, and nodded. "Then welcome, Ray Yazzie. We have much work ahead of us." They spent the rest of the night on the mesa, rebuilding the damaged cairns and performing ceremonies to strengthen the boundaries. As the sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, Ray stood at the edge of the mesa and looked out across the landscape. He could feel the symbol on his palm, now just a faint scar but still warm with residual energy, and he knew that his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a police officer responding to calls and filing reports. He was a guardian, a protector of the boundaries between the world of light and the world of darkness, and that responsibility would stay with him for the rest of his life. 3 days later, Ray returned to duty at the tribal police station. Captain Dazo called him into his office, and Ray could see the concern on his captain's face. "Yazzie," So said, "I heard about what happened in Farmington, Dale Key's death. The reports say you and Thomas Begay were there, that you called it in." Ray nodded. "We were. We were following up on the Atwood case, and we found Key dead in his home. It looked like suicide, Captain. He'd been struggling with his daughter's disappearance for years, and I think it finally became too much for him." So studied him for a long moment, and Ray met his gaze steadily. Finally, So sighed and said, "The FBI is going to want to interview you about what you saw. They're treating it as a suspicious death. Are you prepared for that?" Ray nodded. "I am. I'll tell them everything I saw." So leaned back in his chair. "And the other stuff? The things you mentioned in your report about the canyon, about being attacked?" Ray chose his words carefully. "I think I was mistaken, Captain. I hit my head pretty hard, and in the stress of the moment, I misinterpreted what I was seeing. It was probably just shadows and adrenaline. I'm sorry for any confusion my report caused." So's expression softened slightly. "We all make mistakes, Yazzie. What matters is that you brought Claire Atwood back alive, and that's good police work. I'm reinstating you to full duty, but I want you to take it easy for a while. Stick to routine calls, nothing too stressful. Can you do that for me?" Ray nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you, Captain." As he left Zoe's office, Ray felt a strange sense of peace. He was back on duty, back to being a cop, but he was also something more now. He was a guardian, and he knew that when the next call came in about someone missing in the Mesa country, he would be ready. He would know what to look for, how to read the signs, and how to fight back against the darkness that lurked in the spaces between. He stopped by the hospital that afternoon to check on Claire Atwood. She was sitting up in bed, looking much better than the last time he'd seen her, and she smiled when he walked into the room. "Officer Yazzie," she said, "I wanted to thank you. The doctor said if you hadn't found me when you did, I probably wouldn't have made it." Ray pulled up a chair and sat down. "I'm just glad you're okay. How are you feeling?" Claire touched the bandage on her head. "Better. The headaches are finally starting to fade, and the doctors say I should be able to go home in a few days. But Officer Yazzie, I've been having these dreams. About the Mesa, about something watching me out there. The doctors say it's just trauma, that it's my brain trying to process what happened, but it feels so real." Ray reached out and took her hand, and he could feel the faint warmth of the symbol on his palm, still there, still protecting. "Claire, I need you to listen to me. What you're feeling, those dreams, they're real. There's something out there on the Mesa, something old and dangerous. But it's been contained now, pushed back, and as long as you stay away from that place, you'll be safe. Do you understand?" Claire looked at him with wide eyes. "You're serious, aren't you? You really believe there's something out there?" Ray nodded. "I know there is. I've seen it, fought it. And I need you to promise me that you won't go back to the Mesa, not for any reason. If you need to take photographs for your project, find somewhere else. Anywhere else, just stay away from there." Claire squeezed his hand. "I promise. I don't ever want to go back to that place. Thank you, Officer Yazzie, for saving my life." Ray stood up and smiled. "Just doing my job, Ms. Atwood. You take care of yourself." As he walked out of the hospital and into the bright afternoon sunlight, Ray felt the wind pick up, carrying with it the smell of sage and desert dust. He looked toward the Mesa, toward the distant shadow of Shiprock, and he could feel the boundaries holding strong, could feel the old things contained in their dark places. That night, Ray drove out to Thomas's trailer, and they sat on the front steps together, sharing a thermos of coffee and watching the stars come out. "How does it feel?" Thomas asked. "Being back on duty?" Ray thought about it for a moment. "Strange, like I'm living two different lives at the same time. During the day, I'm just another cop, responding to calls and writing reports. But at night, I'm something else, something that most people would never understand." Thomas nodded. "That's the burden of being a guardian. We walk between worlds, and we can never fully belong to either one. But it's important work, Ray Yazzie, the most important work there is." They sat in silence for a while, and then Ray said, "Thomas, your granddaughter, Emma. When I was fighting the old things, I saw her, or what they'd turned her into. I'm sorry." Thomas was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I know. I saw her too, and I'm grateful that you freed her, that you gave her peace. She's been trapped in that darkness for 15 years, and now she can finally rest. Thank you for that, Ray Yazzie." Ray felt tears prick at his eyes, and he blinked them away. "I wish I could have saved her, saved all of them." Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "You did save them, in the only way that mattered. You released them from the old thing's control, and you made sure that no one else will suffer the same fate. That's more than anyone else has been able to do in 20 years. As the weeks turned into months, Ray settled into his new role as both police officer and guardian. He rebuilt cairns in his off hours, checked the boundaries regularly, and worked with Thomas and Helen to teach others about the old things and how to protect against them. The disappearances in the Mesa country stopped completely, and the area became peaceful again. Just another stretch of beautiful desert rather than a hunting ground for monsters. Claire Atwood recovered fully and moved away from New Mexico, taking a job in Colorado where the mountains were different and the shadows held no memory of the old things. She sent Ray a postcard once, thanking him again for saving her life, and he kept it tucked in his sun visor as a reminder of why he did this work. Captain So never mentioned the incident again, and Ray's career continued without incident. He was promoted to senior officer after 2 years, and he trained new recruits on how to properly respond to missing persons cases, always emphasizing the importance of thorough searches and never giving up on the people who needed help. And at night, when the calls were quiet and the station was empty, Ray would sometimes drive out to the mesa and stand at the edge, looking out across the landscape and listening for any sign that the boundaries were failing, that the old things were stirring again. But the night was always quiet. The cairn stood strong, and the only sound was the wind whispering across the desert. Ray Yazzie had become what the mesa needed. A guardian who walked between light and darkness. A protector who understood that some threats couldn't be fought with guns and badges alone. And though he knew the old things would always be out there, waiting in the spaces between, he also knew that as long as people like him were willing to stand watch, the boundaries would hold. The hunger would remain contained, and the people who walked the Mesa country would be safe. But on the clearest nights when the moon was high and the stars were bright, Ray would sometimes see shadows moving at the edge of his vision, tall and pale and watching. And he would touch the scar on his palm, feel the warmth that still lingered there, and remember the promise the old things had made. They would return. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. And when that day came, Ray Yazzie would be ready. Because he was a guardian now. And guardians never stopped watching. They never stopped fighting. They never stopped protecting the light from the darkness that waited just beyond the edges of the world. The call came through at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The kind of call that Officer Jonas Nez had responded to 100 times before. Single vehicle accident, no injuries reported. Location approximately 3 miles east of Shiprock on Route 64. The dispatcher, Evelyn Curley, had sounded tired when she'd relayed the information, her voice flat and professional despite the late hour. Jonas acknowledged the call, checked his location on the GPS mounted to his dashboard, and started driving east, his patrol unit's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road stretched out before him, empty and black, with the massive silhouette of Shiprock rising against the starlit sky to his left. Jonas had been with the Navajo tribal police for 12 years now, long enough to know these roads like the back of his hand, long enough to have seen just about every kind of accident the desert could produce. He'd grown up in Shiprock, spent his whole childhood running through these red rock canyons and learning the stories his grandmother told about the old days, about the sacred places and the dangerous places and the thin line between them. His grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, and Jonas still missed her voice, missed the way she could make even the most mundane story sound like an epic tale. She'd been the one who'd encouraged him to join the tribal police, told him that protecting the people was the highest calling a person could have, and Jonas had taken that responsibility seriously. He was good at his job, known for being thorough and calm under pressure, and he'd earned the respect of his fellow officers through years of solid, reliable work. But lately, something had been bothering him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake, like there was something moving just at the edge of his vision, something watching him whenever he drove these lonely roads at night. He reached the location the dispatcher had given him and slowed down, scanning the roadside for any sign of the accident. The highway was empty, no other vehicles in sight, and for a moment Jonas thought maybe it had been a false report, someone calling in an accident that hadn't actually happened. It wouldn't be the first time, but then his headlights caught something, a reflection off metal maybe 50 yards ahead, and he pulled over onto the shoulder and activated his light bar. The red and blue lights strobed across the landscape, illuminating a dirt access road that led down into an arroyo, and Jonas could see tire tracks in the sand, fresh ones that cut deep into the soft earth. He grabbed his flashlight, radioed his position to dispatch, and started down the access road on foot. The arroyo was maybe 30 feet wide, its banks steep and rocky, and Jonas could hear water running somewhere below, probably from the recent rain they'd had a few days back. The tire tracks led straight down the slope and disappeared over the edge, and when Jonas reached the lip of the arroyo and shone his flashlight down, he saw the vehicle. It was a silver sedan, probably a Honda or Toyota, and it was sitting nose down in the shallow stream at the bottom of the arroyo, its rear wheels still on dry ground, but its front end partially submerged. The driver's side door was hanging open, and Jonas could see the interior lights were still on, casting a weak yellow glow across the water. He keyed his radio and updated dispatch. Unit 47, I've got a visual on the vehicle. Silver sedan, partial submersion in the arroyo. No sign of the driver yet. I'm going down to investigate. Evelyn's voice crackled back, professional as always. Copy that, 47. Be careful down there. Jonas clipped the radio back onto his belt and started down the slope, his boots sliding on the loose gravel. The descent was steep and treacherous, and he had to use his free hand to grab onto rocks and scrub brush to keep his balance. By the time he reached the bottom, his uniform was covered in dust and his heart was pounding from the exertion. He approached the vehicle carefully, his flashlight sweeping across the scene. The sedan's front end was crumpled, the hood buckled from the impact, and Jonas could see that the windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, but not completely shattered. Water was flowing around the front tires, and he could hear it gurgling as it ran over and around the rocks. Jonas reached the driver's side door and shone his light inside, expecting to find someone injured or unconscious behind the wheel. But the vehicle was empty, the driver's seat vacant, the keys still in the ignition. Jonas frowned, sweeping his light across the interior. There was a purse on the passenger seat, a cell phone in the cup holder, and a half-empty bottle of water in the door pocket. Everything you'd expect to find in a car, except for the person who'd been driving it. Jonas straightened up and looked around, calling out into the darkness. Navajo Tribal Police, if you can hear me, call out. I'm here to help. His voice echoed off the arroyo walls, but there was no response, just the sound of running water and the distant hum of his patrol unit's engine up on the highway. He walked around the vehicle, checking for any sign of where the driver might have gone. There were no footprints leading away from the sedan, no blood on the seats or the steering wheel, nothing to indicate that anyone had been injured in the crash. It was as if the driver had simply vanished into thin air. Jonas pulled out his radio again and called it in. Dispatch, vehicle is empty. No sign of the driver. I'm going to do a search of the immediate area, see if they wandered off or went looking for help. Evelyn acknowledged, and Jonas started walking downstream, following the flow of water, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The arroyo wound through the desert like a serpent, its banks rising high on either side, and Jonas felt a strange sense of claustrophobia as he walked, like the walls were closing in on him. He'd gone maybe 100 yards when he heard it. A voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere ahead of him. Jonas stopped, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm, and he listened. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it sounded like someone calling for help. Jonas quickened his pace, splashing through the shallow water, his flashlight beam bouncing across the rocks. "I'm coming," he shouted. "Hold on, I'm almost there." The voice called out again, and Jonas could make out words now, though they were distorted, like someone speaking through a bad phone connection. "Help me, please, I'm stuck." Jonas rounded a bend in the arroyo and stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight illuminating an empty stretch of sand and rock. There was no one there, no one calling for help, no one injured, just the sound of water and wind and the voice still echoing off the walls. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He swept his flashlight back and forth, searching for any sign of movement, but the arroyo was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice uncertain now. "Is someone there?" The voice answered him, but this time it was closer. So close it sounded like it was coming from right behind him. "I'm here. Help me." Jonas spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, and his flashlight beam caught nothing but shadow and stone. He backed up against the arroyo wall, his hand on his weapon now, every instinct screaming at him that something was very wrong. The voice came again, and this time Jonas realized with sick certainty that it wasn't coming from ahead of him or behind him. It was coming from below him, from the water itself. He looked down at the stream flowing around his boots, and that's when he saw it. A face, pale and distorted, rippling in the water like a reflection, but there was nothing above the water to cast such a reflection. The face was looking up at him, its mouth moving, forming words that Jonas could hear but couldn't quite understand. Jonas stumbled backward, away from the water, and the face vanished, dissolving into the current. His radio crackled to life, Evelyn's voice cutting through the silence. 4-7, what's your status? Are you okay? Jonas grabbed his radio with a shaking hand and tried to steady his voice. I'm fine, dispatch. Still searching for the driver. I thought I heard something, but it was probably just the wind." There was a pause, and then Evelyn said, "Copy that. Let me know when you're clear." Jonas clipped the radio back onto his belt and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He'd been on the job for 12 years, had dealt with drunk drivers and domestic violence and every other kind of human ugliness. But he'd never experienced anything like this. He'd never heard voices where there was no one to speak them, never seen faces in water that shouldn't be there. He wanted to chalk it up to exhaustion, to the late hour and the stress of the job, but he knew better. His grandmother had told him stories about places like this, about arroyos where the dead wandered and spirits whispered to the living. He'd always thought they were just stories, cautionary tales meant to keep children from wandering too far from home. But standing here in the darkness with the sound of that voice, say, still echoing in his ears, Jonas wasn't so sure anymore. He forced himself to keep moving, to continue the search, because that's what a good officer did. You didn't abandon your duty just because you were scared. He walked further downstream, his flashlight sweeping back and forth, and after another 50 yards he found something that made him stop. There, carved into the rock face of the arroyo wall, were symbols. They looked old, weathered by years of wind and rain, but Jonas could still make them out clearly in the beam of his flashlight. They were circular designs, spirals and lines that seemed to form some kind of pattern, and Jonas recognized them immediately. They were Navajo symbols, the kind his grandmother had shown him in her books, the kind that were meant to protect against evil spirits and mark sacred boundaries. Jonas reached out and touched one of the symbols, tracing the lines with his finger, and as he did, he felt a strange warmth emanating from the rock, like the stone itself was alive. The voice came again, but this time it was different. Instead of calling for help, It was speaking his name. Jonas. Jonas Nez. Jonas jerked his hand away from the symbol and spun around, his weapon drawn now, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there? Identify yourself!" The voice laughed, a sound that made his blood run cold, and then it said, "You know who I am, Jonas. You've always known." Jonas felt his mouth go dry, because he did recognize the voice now. Recognized it in a way that made his skin crawl and his heart sink. It was the voice of Daniel Gorman, a former tribal police officer who had disappeared 7 years ago while on patrol in this exact area. Jonas had been a rookie then, fresh out of the academy, and Daniel had been one of his training officers, a good cop with 20 years on the job and a reputation for being thorough and fair. Daniel had vanished without a trace one night. His patrol unit found abandoned on Route 64 with the door hanging open and the engine still running. The investigation had turned up nothing. No evidence of foul play, no body, no clues about what had happened to him. Eventually, the case had been closed, marked as a missing persons cold case, and life had moved on. But Jonas had never forgotten Daniel, had never forgotten the way the older officer had taken him under his wing and taught him what it meant to be a tribal cop. And now, standing in this dark arroyo with Daniel's voice echoing off the walls, Jonas felt a mix of fear and hope that he couldn't quite process. "Daniel?" he called out, his voice shaking. "Daniel, is that you?" The voice answered, still coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm here, Jonas. I've been here all along, waiting for someone to find me. But you need to listen very carefully. You need to get out of this arroyo right now. You need to go back to your vehicle and leave this place and never come back." Jonas felt his hands trembling, the flashlight beam shaking as he tried to aim it toward the source of the voice. "What happened to you, Daniel? Where are you? I can help you. Just tell me where." The voice cut him off, urgent now, almost desperate. "You can't help me, Jonas. No one can. But you can save yourself. Get out of here, now, before they come." Jonas felt ice run through his veins. "Before who comes? Daniel, talk to me. What's going on?" But the voice didn't answer. And instead, Jonas heard something else. Something that made every hair on his body stand on end. It was the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, echoing through the arroyo from somewhere downstream. They were getting closer, moving fast, and Jonas could hear voices now, multiple voices, all speaking at once in a language he didn't understand. Jonas started backing up, his weapon still drawn, his flashlight swinging wildly as he tried to see what was coming. The footsteps grew louder, the voices rising to a cacophony, and Jonas turned and ran. He splashed through the water, his boots slipping on the wet rocks, and he could hear the footsteps behind him now, so close he could almost feel breath on the back of his neck. He ran with everything he had, his lungs burning, his legs pumping, and when he reached the spot where the silver sedan sat half submerged in the stream, he didn't stop. He scrambled up the slope, his hands grabbing at rocks and dirt, pulling himself up toward the highway. Behind him, the voices were screaming now, a horrible chorus that seemed to shake the very air, and Jonas could see shadows moving at the bottom of the arroyo, tall figures that moved with impossible speed. He reached the top of the slope and stumbled onto the highway, his chest heaving, and he looked back down into the arroyo one last time. The shadows were gone. The voices were silent. The arroyo was empty and quiet, just water flowing over rocks and wind rustling through the sage. Jonas stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just experienced, and then his radio crackled to life. 4-7, I've got a call coming in from a cell phone. Woman says she crashed her car on Route 64. Says she climbed out of the arroyo and walked to a gas station about 5 miles east of your location. She's safe. You can clear the scene. Jonas looked down at the radio in his hand, and then back at the arroyo. The woman was safe. She'd walked away from the crash. But if that was true, then whose voice had been calling for help? And whose face had he seen in the water? Jonas got back into his patrol unit and sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to call it in, wanted to tell Evelyn what he'd experienced, but he knew how that would sound. He'd sound crazy, paranoid, like he was losing his grip on reality. So instead he just sat there, staring out at the empty highway, and tried to convince himself that it had all been his imagination, stress and exhaustion playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He knew that something was in that arroyo, something that spoke with Daniel Gorman's voice, something that had been waiting for him. And as he finally put the unit in gear and started driving back toward town, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever he'd encountered down there in the darkness was far from finished with him. He drove back to the station in silence, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. When he pulled into the parking lot, he sat in his unit for a few minutes, composing himself, making sure his hands had stopped shaking. Then he went inside and found Evelyn sitting at the dispatch desk, her eyes tired but alert. She looked up as he came in and said, "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jonas forced a smile and said, "Just a long night. The woman who crashed her car, she's okay?" Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, she walked away without a scratch. Lucky, considering how far down that arroyo goes. She's at the hospital now getting checked out, but she should be fine. You want me to send someone to tow the vehicle?" Jonas nodded. "Yeah, get a tow truck out there first thing in the morning. No rush. It's not blocking traffic." Evelyn made a note and then looked back at him. "You sure you're okay? You look pale." Jonas rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the stubble on his jaw, feeling the exhaustion in his bones. "I'm fine. Just need some coffee and a few hours of sleep. It's been one of those nights." Evelyn gave him a sympathetic look and said, "Tell me about it. I've got 3 more hours on this shift and I'm already counting down the minutes. Go home, Jonas. Get some rest." Jonas thanked her and headed out to his vehicle. But as he drove through the quiet streets of Shiprock, heading toward his small apartment on the east side of town, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in that arroyo. He thought about Daniel Gorman, about the way his voice had sounded, about the warning he'd given. Get out before they come. Before who comes? Jonas had worked with Daniel for only 6 months before the older officer disappeared. But in that time, Daniel had taught him more about being a cop than anyone else. He'd taught Jonas how to read people, how to diffuse tense situations, how to trust his instincts when something didn't feel right. And right now, Jonas's instincts were screaming at him that something was very, very wrong. He parked in front of his apartment and sat in the darkness for a moment, watching the shadows move across the walls of the surrounding buildings. Finally, he got out and went inside, locking the door behind him and making sure all the windows were secure. He didn't know why he felt the need to check, didn't know what he thought he was protecting himself from, but he did it anyway. Jonas took a long hot shower, trying to wash away the dust and the fear, and then he made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at his kitchen table with his laptop. He opened a browser and started searching for information about Daniel Gorman's disappearance, reading through old news articles and police reports that he'd seen a dozen times before. The story was always the same. Daniel had been on routine patrol, had radioed in that he was stopping to investigate something on Route 64, and then he'd gone silent. When other officers arrived at the scene 20 minutes later, they'd found his patrol unit empty, the door open, the engine running, and no sign of Daniel anywhere. The search had gone on for weeks, with volunteers and police officers combing every inch of the surrounding desert, but they'd never found a body, never found any evidence of what had happened to him. Jonas leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, trying to think. If Daniel was dead, if his body was somewhere in that arroyo, then what Jonas had heard tonight could have been just an echo, a remnant of Daniel's final moments somehow trapped in that place. His grandmother had told him about such things, about how violent or traumatic deaths could leave impressions on the land, like recordings that played over and over. But if that was true, then why had Daniel's voice warned him? Why had it told him to leave before they came? Jonas rubbed his eyes and drained the rest of his coffee, feeling the caffeine do little to combat his exhaustion. He needed to sleep, needed to clear his head, but he knew that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. He closed his laptop and stood up, walking over to the small bookshelf in his living room where he kept a few of his grandmother's things. There was a photo of her, taken when she was younger, her face strong and proud, and next to it was a leather-bound journal that she'd kept for most of her life. Jonas had inherited it after she passed away, and he'd read through it once, finding page after page of stories and wisdom written in her careful handwriting. Now he pulled the journal from the shelf and sat back down at the table, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a section about the arroyos near Shiprock, about places where the veil between worlds was thin, where spirits walked, and the dead sometimes spoke to the living. His grandmother's handwriting was neat and precise, and Jonas could almost hear her voice as he read the words. There are places in our land where death is not final, where the spirits of those who died violently or tragically cannot find peace. These places are dangerous, not because the spirits wish us harm, but because their pain and confusion can draw us into their world. If you hear voices in the arroyo, do not answer them. If you see faces in the water, do not look too long. These are echoes of the dead, and they will pull you down into the darkness if you let them. Jonas felt his throat tighten as he read, because that was exactly what had happened to him tonight. He'd heard the voices. He'd seen the face in the water. And if he hadn't run when he did, if he'd stayed just a little longer, would he have been pulled down too? He closed the journal and sat there in the silence of his apartment, feeling more alone than he had in years. He thought about calling someone, maybe one of the other officers who might understand, but he knew how it would sound. And besides, who was he going to call? Who was going to believe him when he said he'd heard a dead man's voice in an arroyo? Jonas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street below. The town was quiet at this hour, most people asleep in their beds, and Jonas envied them their peaceful ignorance. He wished he could go back to not knowing, to believing that the world was rational and explainable, but that ship had sailed the moment he'd heard Daniel Gorman's voice echoing through that arroyo. Jonas finally went to bed around 4 a.m, lying on top of the covers with his clothes still on, too wired to undress. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over, and when he finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep, he dreamed of water and shadows and voices calling his name. He woke a few hours later to his phone ringing, the harsh sound cutting through the fog of exhaustion. Jonas fumbled for it on the nightstand and answered without looking at the caller ID. "Yeah?" It was Evelyn from dispatch, and her voice was tense. "Jonas, sorry to wake you, but we've got a situation. Captain wants you to come in, says it's urgent." Jonas sat up, rubbing his face. What kind of situation? Evelyn hesitated and then said, "Someone found something in the arroyo where you were last night. Where that car crashed. You need to get down here." Jonas felt his stomach drop. What did they find? But Evelyn had already hung up, and Jonas was left sitting on his bed, staring at his phone, feeling the dread settle over him like a physical weight. He got dressed quickly, splashed some water on his face, and drove to the station, his mind racing with possibilities. When he walked into the building, he found several other officers gathered in the conference room, their faces grim, and Captain Franklin So standing at the head of the table with his arms crossed. Zoe looked up as Jonas entered and gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down, Nez. We need to talk." Jonas sat, his heart pounding, and So pulled up an image on the projector at the front of the room. It was a photograph taken from above, probably from a drone, showing the arroyo where Jonas had been the night before. And there, at the bottom of the arroyo near where the silver sedan had crashed, was something that made Jonas's blood run cold. It was a body, partially buried in the sand, one arm reaching up as if the person had been trying to claw their way out. So's voice was heavy when he spoke. Maintenance crew found it this morning when they went to tow the vehicle. They called it in immediately. We're running identification now, but based on the condition of the remains, the coroner estimates it's been there for several years. Jonas stared at the image on the screen, his mind reeling. Several years. You think it could be... Zoe nodded slowly. Daniel Gorman. Yeah, that's what we think. The location matches where his patrol unit was found, and the timeline fits. We'll know for sure once we get a positive ID, but I wanted you here because you were at the scene last night, and I need to know if you saw anything unusual. Jonas opened his mouth to speak, to tell So about the voices and the face in the water and Daniel's warning, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain what he'd experienced without sounding insane? So instead he just shook his head and said, "No, sir, nothing unusual. Just the crashed vehicle and no sign of the driver. She'd already left by the time I got there." So studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether Jonas was telling the truth, and then he nodded. "All right. We're going to need you to write up a detailed report of everything you saw last night, every step you took, every observation you made. And I want you to stay away from that arroyo until we've finished processing the scene. Understood?" Jonas nodded. "Yes, sir. Understood." As the meeting broke up and the other officers filed out, Jonas sat there for a moment staring at the image on the screen. Daniel Gorman's body, buried in the sand for 7 years, found less than 24 hours after Jonas had heard his voice calling out for help. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't be random chance. Daniel's spirit had been trying to tell him something, trying to warn him about something. And Jonas knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Whatever was in that arroyo, whatever had killed Daniel and kept his body hidden for all these years, it was still there. And now that Jonas had heard its voices and seen its faces, he had a feeling it wasn't going to let him go easily. Jonas spent the rest of that day at the station, typing up his report and trying to keep his hands from shaking every time he thought about what he'd experienced in the arroyo. He wrote down everything he could remember about the accident scene, the empty vehicle, the search pattern he'd followed downstream, but he left out the voices and the face in the water, and Daniel Gorman's warning. Those details stayed locked in his mind, too dangerous to share, too impossible to explain. By the time he finished the report and sent it to Captain So, it was almost 6 in the evening, and Jonas felt like he'd been awake for days. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the parking lot, but before he could reach his unit, Evelyn caught up with him, her expression troubled. "Jonas, wait. I need to talk to you." Jonas stopped, turning to face her. Evelyn Curley was in her mid-40s, a single mother of 2 who'd been working dispatch for the tribal police for almost 20 years. She was good at her job, unflappable under pressure, and Jonas had always respected her professionalism. But right now, she looked worried, her dark eyes searching his face. "What is it?" Jonas asked. Evelyn glanced around to make sure they were alone, and then she said quietly, I heard something on the radio last night. When you were down in that arroyo. It came through on your channel, but it wasn't your voice." Jonas felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean? What did you hear?" Evelyn hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue, and then she said, "It was a man's voice talking about being stuck, asking for help. But the weird thing is your radio wasn't transmitting. The channel was dead on your end. So where did that voice come from?" Jonas felt cold sweat break out on his forehead. "You heard it too? You heard the voice?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "I did. And Jonas, I recognized it. It sounded like Daniel Gorman. I worked dispatch when he went missing, and I remember his voice. It was him, I'm sure of it." Jonas looked away, his mind racing. So it hadn't been his imagination. Evelyn had heard it too. Heard Daniel's voice coming through the radio, even though Jonas hadn't been transmitting. That meant it was real, or at least real enough that two people had experienced it. "Did you tell Captain so?" Jonas asked. Evelyn shook her head. "No. I wasn't sure if I should. I mean, how do you explain something like that? But after they found the body this morning, I started thinking maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Maybe Daniel was trying to tell us something." Jonas met her gaze and saw the same fear and confusion he was feeling reflected in her eyes. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something. Last night, when I was in that arroyo, I heard more than just that one voice. I heard Daniel speaking to me directly, telling me to get out, warning me that something was coming, and I saw—" He paused, trying to find the words. "I saw a face in the water. It was looking up at me, moving its mouth, speaking. And then there were footsteps, dozens of them, and shadows moving toward me. I ran because I thought if I stayed down there one more second, I was going to end up like Daniel." Evelyn's face went pale. "Oh my God, Jonas. You need to report this. You need to tell Captain So what you experienced." Jonas shook his head. "I can't. He'll think I'm losing my mind. He'll pull me off duty, send me for a psych eval. And besides, what good would it do? They found Daniel's body. The case is closed. What am I supposed to say? That I think there's something supernatural in that arroyo? That Daniel's ghost warned me about it?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My grandmother used to tell stories about that arroyo. She said it was a bad place. The people who went down there sometimes didn't come back. She said there were things living in the water, old things that fed on the lost and the lonely. I always thought they were just stories. But after what happened to Daniel, after what you're telling me now, I'm not so sure." Jonas felt a chill run through him. "What kind of things? What did your grandmother say about them?" Evelyn looked uncomfortable, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. She called them the water walkers. She said they were spirits of people who had drowned in the arroyos during flash floods, people whose bodies were never recovered. She said they were trapped between worlds, unable to move on, and that they called out to the living, trying to lure them into the water so they wouldn't be alone anymore. It's an old Navajo legend, probably just superstition, but... She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Jonas rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down on him. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Evelyn. All I know is that something is wrong with that arroyo, and I have a feeling this isn't over." Evelyn reached out and squeezed his arm. "Be careful, Jonas. If my grandmother's stories are true, if the water walkers are real, then you're in danger. They don't let go once they've marked someone." Jonas nodded, trying to push down the fear that was threatening to overwhelm him. "I will. Thanks for telling me, Evelyn. And if you hear anything else strange on the radio, any more voices, you let me know immediately." Evelyn promised she would, and Jonas got into his unit and drove home, his mind churning with everything he'd learned. water walkers, spirits trapped between worlds. It sounded like something out of a nightmare, but after what he'd experienced last night, Jonas couldn't dismiss it as mere superstition. Something was in that arroyo, something that had killed Daniel Gorman and hidden his body for 7 years, and now it had turned its attention to Jonas. He spent the evening at home, trying to distract himself with television and research, pulling up everything he could find online about Navajo legends and water spirits. Most of what he found was vague, filtered through the lens of white anthropologists who didn't really understand the culture they were studying. But there were a few accounts that matched what Evelyn had told him. Stories about arroyos where people disappeared during flash floods, where their spirits remained trapped in the water, calling out to passers-by. The accounts described them as vengeful or desperate, depending on the source, but they all agreed on one thing. Once the water walkers marked you, once they learned your name, they would pursue you until they claimed you or until you found a way to release them. Jonas closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his living room, staring at the ceiling. Release them. That was the key, according to the stories. The water walkers could only be freed if their bodies were found and properly buried, if the rituals were performed that would allow their spirits to move on. But Daniel Gorman's body had been found. It was at the medical examiner's office right now, being processed and prepared for burial. So why had Jonas heard his voice last night? Why had Daniel's spirit warned him if his body had been lying in that arroyo all along, waiting to be discovered? Unless Daniel wasn't the only one down there. Unless there were other bodies, other spirits, still waiting to be found. The thought made Jonas sick to his stomach. He thought about all the missing persons cases from the reservation, all the people who had vanished over the years without a trace. How many of them had ended up in that arroyo? How many of them were still down there, buried in the sand, their spirits trapped and calling out for help? Jonas stood up and walked to his kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He needed to go back to that arroyo, needed to search it properly, but he knew Captain So would never approve it. The scene was being processed as a potential crime scene now, and Jonas had been ordered to stay away. But if he didn't go back, if he didn't try to find the other bodies, then the water walkers would keep calling to him, keep trying to lure him down into the darkness. Jonas made a decision. He would wait until the investigation was officially closed, until the scene was released, and then he would go back to the arroyo on his own time. He would search every inch of it, and if there were more bodies buried there, he would find them. It was the only way to put the spirits to rest, the only way to stop the voices. Jonas finished his water and went to bed, but sleep was a long time coming. When it finally did, his dreams were full of dark water and pale faces, and voices calling his name over and over until he woke up gasping for air, his sheets soaked with sweat. He looked at the clock and saw it was only 3 in the morning. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of his own breathing, and tried to convince himself that everything was going to be okay, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next few days passed in a blur of routine police work and mounting anxiety. Jonas responded to calls, wrote reports, and tried to act like everything was normal, but he could feel the weight of what he'd experienced pressing down on him constantly. Captain So announced that the medical examiner had positively identified the body found in the arroyo as Daniel Gorman, and the department held a small memorial service for their fallen colleague. Jonas attended, standing in the back of the room and listening to people talk about Daniel's years of service, his dedication to the community, his tragic disappearance. But all Jonas could think about was Daniel's voice in the arroyo, the warning he'd given, the desperate tone that suggested he was still in pain even after death. After the service, Jonas approached Captain So and asked when the arroyo would be released from the investigation. So gave him a curious look and said, "We're still processing evidence, but it should be cleared by the end of the week." Why do you ask?" Jonas shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just curious. I was the first one on scene and I want to make sure everything was handled properly." Zoe nodded slowly. It was. The crime scene techs did a thorough job. But Nez, I want to ask you something. Are you doing okay? You've seemed distracted lately, and after what you went through finding that scene, I just want to make sure you're handling it all right. Jonas forced a smile. "I'm fine, Captain. Just tired. It's been a rough week." So studied him for a moment longer, and then he clapped Jonas on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself. And if you need to talk to someone, we have counselors available. No shame in using them." Jonas thanked him and left, but he had no intention of talking to a counselor. How could he explain to a therapist that he was being haunted by the spirit of a dead police officer? That he heard voices in the water and saw faces that shouldn't exist? They'd put him on administrative leave faster than he could blink. No, Jonas had to handle this on his own. Had to figure out what was happening and put a stop to it before it consumed him. That night, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and around midnight he heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling his name. "Jonas! Jonas Nez!" Jonas sat up, his heart pounding, and the voice came again, clearer this time. It was coming from outside, from somewhere beyond his apartment window. Jonas got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. The street below was empty, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights, but he could still hear the voice. "Jonas, come to the water. We're waiting for you." Jonas felt his hands start to shake. They were here. The water walkers had followed him home, had tracked him to his apartment. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in short gasps, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Jonas, you promised to help us. You have to come back. You have to find us." Jonas grabbed his phone and called Evelyn, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy. "Jonas, what's wrong? It's the middle of the night." "I can hear them," Jonas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The voices. They're outside my apartment. They're calling to me, Evelyn. They won't stop." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Evelyn said, her voice suddenly alert. "Listen to me, Jonas. Do not go outside. Do you understand? Do not answer them. Do not acknowledge them. You need to protect yourself. Do you have any sage? Any cedar?" Jonas looked around his apartment wildly. I don't know. Maybe in my grandmother's things." Evelyn's voice was firm, commanding. "Find it. Burn it. The smoke will keep them away, at least temporarily, and then you need to call someone who knows about these things, someone who can help you. I'll give you a name, someone my grandmother used to go to when she needed spiritual help. His name is Thomas Begay, and he lives on the east side of town. Call him first thing in the morning." Jonas nodded, even though Evelyn couldn't see him. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you, Evelyn." He hung up and went to the small box of his grandmother's belongings, rummaging through it until he found a bundle of dried sage wrapped in red cloth. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it, but he managed to light it with a match, and the sharp, cleansing scent filled his apartment. The voices outside grew fainter, receding into the distance, and Jonas sank down onto his couch, clutching the smoldering sage bundle like a lifeline. He sat there for the rest of the night, burning sage and watching the window, waiting for the voices to return. But they didn't, and when the sun finally rose, Jonas felt a small measure of relief wash over him. He called in sick to work, something he rarely did, and then he pulled up the phone number for Thomas Begay that Evelyn had given him. The phone rang several times before an elderly man answered, his voice gravelly with age. "Yes?" Jonas took a deep breath. Mr. Begay, my name is Jonas Nez. I'm with the Navajo Tribal Police, and I was given your number by Evelyn Curley. She said you might be able to help me with a spiritual problem." There was a long pause, and then Thomas said, "What kind of problem?" Jonas struggled to find the words. "I think I'm being followed by water spirits, the water walkers. I encountered them in an arroyo a few days ago, and now they're coming to my home, calling my name. I don't know how to stop them." Thomas was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street in 1 hour. We'll talk." The line went dead, and Jonas stared at his phone, hoping he'd made the right decision. He got dressed, holstered his service weapon out of habit even though he wasn't on duty, and drove to the coffee shop. Thomas Begay was already there when Jonas arrived, sitting in a booth near the back. He was older than Jonas had expected, probably in his 70s, with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and deep lines etched into his weathered face. His eyes were sharp and knowing, and as Jonas sat down across from him, Thomas studied him with an intensity that made Jonas feel exposed. "Tell me everything," Thomas said. "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." So Jonas did. He told Thomas about responding to the accident call, about finding the empty vehicle in the arroyo, about hearing Daniel Gorman's voice and seeing the face in the water. He told him about the footsteps and the shadows, about running for his life, about the body being found the next day. And he told him about the voices coming to his apartment in the middle of the night, about how they wouldn't stop calling his name. When he finished, Thomas sat back and nodded slowly, as if everything Jonas had said confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You're marked," Thomas said quietly. "The water walkers have chosen you, and they won't let go until you fulfill what they need. They called out to you because they sensed that you could help them, that you had the strength and the will to do what needs to be done." Jonas felt a surge of frustration. Help them how? Daniel Gorman's body has been found. He can be buried properly now. So why are they still coming after me? Thomas shook his head. "Because Daniel isn't the only one down there. That arroyo has been claiming people for decades, maybe longer. Their bodies are still buried in the sand, their spirits trapped in the water, unable to move on. They reached out to you because you're a police officer, because finding the lost is your job. They want you to find them all, to bring them home so they can finally rest." Jonas felt his stomach drop. "All of them? How many are we talking about?" Thomas's expression was grim. "I don't know. 10, 20, maybe more. That arroyo is a cursed place, Officer Nez. It always has been. The old people knew to stay away from it, but over the years that knowledge has been forgotten. And now the spirits are desperate, crying out to anyone who will listen." Jonas ran his hands through his hair, feeling overwhelmed. "I can't do this alone. I'd need equipment, manpower, permission from the department. Captain Zoe would never approve a search based on what? Ghost stories?" Thomas leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Then you don't tell him about the spirits. You find another reason to search that arroyo. You're a police officer. You know how to build a case, how to find evidence. Look at the missing persons files, find patterns, connect the dots. And when you have enough to justify a search, you go to your captain with facts and logic, not spirits and legends." Jonas considered this, turning the idea over in his mind. It made sense. He could pull the old missing persons cases, look for anyone who had disappeared in that area, build a profile that would justify a thorough search of the arroyo. It would take time and effort, but it was possible. "And what do I do in the meantime?" Jonas asked. "How do I keep the water walkers away while I'm working on this?" Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with sinew. "This is a protection charm. It contains cedar, sage, and turquoise blessed in a traditional ceremony. Keep it with you at all times and they won't be able to get close. But Officer Nez, you need to understand something. This protection is temporary. The only way to truly free yourself from the water walkers is to find the bodies and give them proper burials. Until you do that, they will keep calling to you, keep trying to bring you into their world. And eventually the protection will fail, and they will claim you just like they claimed Daniel Gorman. Jonas took the pouch, feeling the weight of it in his hand. How much time do I have? Thomas's expression was grave. Weeks, maybe a month if you're lucky. But the longer you wait, the stronger they'll become. They'll start appearing in your dreams, in your waking hours. You'll see them everywhere you go, hear them in every sound. And when the protection finally fails, you'll feel an irresistible urge to go to them, to walk into that water and join them. You have to find those bodies before that happens, Officer Nez. Your life depends on it. Jonas nodded, tucking the pouch into his pocket. I'll do whatever it takes. Thank you for your help, Mr. Begay. Thomas stood up, preparing to leave, but then he paused and said, one more thing. When you do find the bodies, when you bring them up from that arroyo, you need to perform the proper ceremonies. I can help you with that, but it's important. If you don't release their spirits the right way, they'll just remain trapped, and all of this will have been for nothing. Jonas promised he would, and Thomas left, disappearing into the morning sunlight. Jonas sat there for a few more minutes, his coffee growing cold, and then he stood up and headed back to his apartment. He had work to do. He spent the rest of the day at his kitchen table, his laptop open, pulling up every missing persons case from the past 30 years that had any connection to the Route 64 corridor. There were more than he'd expected. Dozens of people who had vanished without a trace in that area. Some were locals, some were tourists, some were drifters passing through. But the pattern was clear. People went missing near that arroyo, and they were never found. Jonas made a spreadsheet, documenting names, dates, last known locations, and circumstances of disappearance. He cross-referenced weather reports, looking for flash flood events that might have swept people into the arroyo, and he found several that matched. By the time the sun set, Jonas had a list of 23 people who had disappeared in the vicinity of the arroyo over the past 3 decades. 23 people whose bodies might still be buried in that sand, whose spirits might be trapped in that water. It was more than enough to justify a comprehensive search, more than enough to convince Captain So that there was a serious problem that needed to be addressed. Jonas saved his work and closed his laptop, feeling both exhausted and energized. He had a plan now, a way forward, and for the first time since he'd heard Daniel Gorman's voice in the arroyo, Jonas felt like he had some measure of control over the situation. That night, Jonas slept better than he had in days, the protection charm clutched in his hand. He didn't hear any voices, didn't see any faces in the shadows, and when he woke up the next morning, he felt almost normal. He got dressed, went to the station, and requested a meeting with Captain So. The captain agreed to see him that afternoon, and Jonas spent the intervening hours refining his presentation, making sure every fact was accurate, every connection logical. When the time came, Jonas walked into Zo's office with his laptop and a printed report, and he laid out everything he'd found. Captain So listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as Jonas went through the list of missing persons, showing the pattern, demonstrating the connection to the arroyo. When Jonas finished, So leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "This is good work, Nez. Thorough and well-researched. I had no idea there were this many missing persons cases connected to that location." Jonas felt a surge of relief. "So, you'll authorize a search?" So nodded slowly. "I will, but it's going to take time to organize. we'll need ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, a full forensics team. I'll have to coordinate with the BIA and possibly the FBI if we're dealing with multiple homicides. This could be a serial killer dumping ground, which means we need to do this by the book. Jonas felt his heart sink. Time. So was talking about weeks or possibly months of preparation, and Jonas didn't have that kind of time. The water walkers were growing stronger every day, and the protection charm Thomas had given him wouldn't last forever. "Captain," Jonas said carefully, "with all due respect, I think we need to move faster. If there are bodies down there, they've been waiting decades to be found. The families of these missing people deserve answers, and the longer we wait, the more evidence we lose to the elements." Zoe gave him a sharp look. "I understand your concern, Nez, but we can't rush this. If we contaminate evidence or miss something important because we move too fast, it could jeopardize any potential prosecutions. We do this right, or we don't do it at all." Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to tell Zoe about the spirits and the voices and the ticking clock, but he knew it would be pointless. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Yes, sir, I understand." As Jonas left Zoe's office, he felt the protection charm in his pocket grow warm, almost hot, and he knew what it meant. The water walkers were close, pushing against the barrier of the charm, trying to break through. Time was running out faster than he'd thought, and if he didn't find a way to speed up the search, he was going to end up just like Daniel Gorman. Another body buried in that cursed arroyo. Another spirit trapped between worlds. Jonas made a decision in that moment, one that went against every regulation and protocol he'd been trained to follow. He was going back to that arroyo tonight, alone, and he was going to start searching for bodies himself. If he found evidence, if he could bring back something concrete, it would force Captain So to move faster. It was risky, possibly career-ending if he was caught, but Jonas was out of options. The water walkers had marked him, and the only way to save himself was to give them what they wanted. Jonas waited until well after midnight before making his move. He'd gone home after his shift, changed into dark civilian clothes, and gathered the equipment he'd need. A high-powered flashlight, a small folding shovel he kept in his truck, evidence bags, his service weapon, and the protection charm Thomas Begay had given him. The charm was hot now, almost burning against his chest where he'd hung it on a cord around his neck, and Jonas knew that meant the water walkers were close, pressing against the barrier, waiting for their chance. He drove to the arroyo without using his patrol unit, taking his personal truck instead, and he parked it a quarter-mile down the road so no one would spot it if they happened to drive by. The walk to the arroyo was dark and quiet, with only the stars and a sliver of moon to light his way. As Jonas approached the edge of the arroyo, he could hear the water flowing below. That same soft gurgling sound he'd heard the night he'd found Daniel Gorman's voice. The protection charm burned hotter, and Jonas had to adjust it so it wasn't directly against his skin. He stood at the top of the slope and looked down into the darkness, and for a moment his courage almost failed him. Everything in his body was screaming at him to turn around, to get back in his truck and drive away and never come back. But he thought about the 23 names on his list, about the families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones, and he forced himself to start down the slope. His boots slipped on the loose gravel, and he had to use his hands to steady himself. But eventually he reached the bottom of the arroyo and stood there in the shallow stream, the water flowing around his ankles. The arroyo was different at night, transformed by darkness into something alien and threatening. The walls rose up on either side of him like the ribs of some massive creature, and the sound of the water seemed louder, more insistent. Jonas turned on his flashlight and started walking upstream, away from where Daniel's body had been found, sweeping the beam back and forth across the sand and rocks. He was looking for any sign of disturbance in the ground, any indication that something, or someone, might be buried beneath the surface. He'd gone maybe 50 yards when he heard the first voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere behind him. "Jonas, you came back." Jonas stopped, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon, but he forced himself not to turn around. Thomas had told him not to engage with the spirits, not to acknowledge them directly unless absolutely necessary. He kept walking, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and the voice came again, closer now. "Jonas, we've been waiting. We knew you would come." Jonas felt sweat break out on his forehead despite the cool night air. The protection charm was burning like fire against his chest, and he could feel it working, could feel the barrier it created, pushing back against the spirits that wanted to draw him in. He focused on his task, scanning the ground, looking for anything that might indicate a burial site. The arroyo was littered with debris from past floods, branches, pieces of trash, chunks of rock, and it was hard to distinguish between natural formations and signs of human activity. But Jonas had been trained to notice details, to see patterns where others saw only chaos, and after another 20 minutes of searching, he found something that made him stop. There, near the base of the arroyo wall, was a section of sand that looked different from the surrounding area. It was slightly depressed, as if something beneath it had settled or compacted over time, and when Jonas knelt down and ran his hand across the surface, he could feel that the sand was looser, less packed than it should be. His heart began to pound as he pulled out the folding shovel and started to dig. The sand came away easily at first, loose and dry, but as he went deeper it became damp and heavy. Jonas worked methodically, carefully removing layers of sand and setting them aside, and after about 10 minutes his shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It was fabric, dark and rotted, and Jonas's breath caught in his throat. He set the shovel aside and used his hands, brushing away the sand with careful movements, and slowly a shape began to emerge. It was a body, or what was left of one. The clothing had mostly disintegrated, but Jonas could see the outline of a human skeleton, the bones dark and stained from years in the sand. He sat back on his heels, his hands shaking, and pulled out his phone to take photographs, documenting everything just as he'd been trained. This was evidence, proof that his theory about the arroyo had been correct, and it was enough to force Captain So to accelerate the official search. But as Jonas worked, he became aware that he was no longer alone. The voices had grown louder, multiplying, until it sounded like dozens of people were speaking at once, their words overlapping and creating a cacophony that made it hard to think. "You found me, thank you, but there are more. So many more. You have to find them all." Jonas stood up and backed away from the body, his flashlight sweeping across the arroyo, and that's when he saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, standing in the water all around him. They were dressed in various styles of clothing from different eras, some in modern jeans and t-shirts, others in clothes from decades past, and they were all staring at him with empty eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like mirrors. Jonas felt his blood run cold, because he could see through them, could see the rock wall of the arroyo behind them, but they were there, as real as anything he'd ever seen. The protection charm was burning so hot now it was painful, and Jonas could smell something acrid, like burning sage, as the charm worked to keep the spirits at bay. One of the figures stepped forward, and Jonas recognized him immediately. It was Daniel Gorman, looking exactly as he had 7 years ago when he disappeared, his uniform clean and pressed, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Jonas," Daniel said, his voice clearer now than it had been before. "You're doing the right thing. But you need to understand what you're dealing with. This arroyo, it's not just a burial ground, it's a trap. A place where the boundaries between worlds are thin. The people who died here, we didn't all drown in floods. Some of us were brought here, sacrificed to something old and hungry that lives in the water. And that thing, it's still here, Jonas. It's always been here. Jonas felt his throat go dry. What are you talking about? What thing? Daniel's expression was grim. The old people called it the Water Guardian, but that's not what it is. It's something that feeds on death, on the energy of trapped spirits. Every person who dies in this arroyo, every spirit that gets trapped here makes it stronger. That's why there are so many of us, Jonas. It's been feeding for generations, maybe longer. And now that you found us, now that you're trying to release us, it's going to try to stop you. It needs us trapped here, needs our energy to survive. Jonas looked around at the assembled spirits, at the dozens of pale faces staring at him, and he felt a wave of despair wash over him. How do I fight something like that? How do I stop it? Daniel shook his head. You can't fight it directly. It's too powerful, too old. But you can starve it. If you find all the bodies, if you give us proper burials and perform the ceremonies that will release our spirits, it will lose its power. It will have nothing left to feed on, and it will retreat back to wherever it came from. But Jonas, you have to do it quickly. The longer you're here, the more vulnerable you are. The protection charm Thomas gave you, it won't last much longer. You can feel it burning, can't you? That means it's close to failing. Jonas touched the charm through his shirt, feeling the heat radiating from it. And he knew Daniel was right. He had maybe another hour, 2 at most, before the charm burned out completely and he was left defenseless. Tell me where the bodies are, Jonas said, his voice urgent. Help me find them so I can get out of here. Daniel turned and pointed upstream. There are 3 more within 100 yards of here. After that, the rest are scattered throughout the arroyo, all the way up to where it forks near the mesa. You'll need help, Jonas. You can't do this alone, not in one night. Jonas felt frustration rising in his chest. Then what am I supposed to do? Captain So won't authorize the full search for weeks, and I don't have weeks. The water walkers are already coming to my apartment at night. If I don't finish this soon, I'm going to end up like you. Daniel's expression softened with something that might have been pity. Then you need to take a risk. You need to bring others here tonight, people who can help you search. And Jonas, they need to be people who will believe you, who won't dismiss what you're experiencing as mental illness or exhaustion. Think about who you can trust, who has the strength to face what's in this arroyo. Jonas thought immediately of Thomas Begay, but the old man was in his 70s and probably couldn't handle the physical demands of searching the arroyo at night. Then he thought of Evelyn Curley. She'd heard Daniel's voice on the radio, had told him about the water walkers. She believed him, and she was tough, someone who could keep her head in a crisis. But he hated the idea of putting her in danger, of bringing her into this nightmare. As if reading his thoughts, Daniel said, She's already part of this, Jonas. The moment she heard my voice, the moment she acknowledged what was happening, she became connected to it. The water walkers know about her now, and they'll come for her eventually, just like they came for you. You'd be doing her a favor by bringing her here, by giving her a chance to end this before it's too late. Jonas pulled out his phone and stared at it for a moment, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he dialed Evelyn's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. Jonas, what's wrong? Jonas took a deep breath. Evelyn, I need your help. I'm at the arroyo and I've found a body. But there are more, and I need someone I can trust to help me search for them. I know it's asking a lot. I know it sounds crazy, but Evelyn cut him off. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Send me your location. Jonas felt a surge of gratitude so intense it almost brought tears to his eyes. Thank you, Evelyn, and bring sage if you have it. You're going to need protection. Evelyn promised she would and hung up, and Jonas turned back to Daniel's spirit. "She's coming. Now, show me where the other bodies are." Daniel nodded and began walking upstream, his translucent form gliding over the water without making a ripple. And Jonas followed, marking the locations on his phone's GPS as Daniel pointed them out. They found 2 more bodies within the next 50 yards, both buried in the sand just as the first one had been, and Jonas photographed them and marked the locations. The third body was further upstream, near a bend in the arroyo where the water ran deeper, and Jonas had to wade through waist-deep water to reach it. As he worked, the other spirits watched from the shadows, their voices a constant murmur in the background. Some of them were crying, others were pleading, and a few just stood in silence, their empty eyes tracking his movements. Jonas tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the task at hand, but it was getting harder to maintain his concentration. The protection charm was failing. He could feel it, the heat diminishing as the power drained away, and with each passing minute the spirits grew bolder, moving closer, their voices growing louder. By the time Evelyn arrived, Jonas had marked 5 bodies total, and he was starting to feel a strange pull, a compulsion to walk deeper into the arroyo, to follow the water upstream to wherever it led. Evelyn came down the slope carrying a heavy-duty flashlight and a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and when she reached Jonas she looked around at the empty arroyo with wide eyes. "Where are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The spirits, I can feel them, but I can't see them." Jonas pointed to where Daniel's ghost stood watching them from 20 feet away. "They're all around us. Daniel Gorman is right there, and there are dozens more scattered throughout the arroyo. They've been showing me where the bodies are buried." Evelyn followed his gaze and shuddered, even though she couldn't see what Jonas was seeing. "We need to work fast. I brought sage and cedar, enough for both of us, and I brought something else." She reached into the bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. "If we're going to convince Captain Zoe to move on this tonight, we need evidence. I'm going to record everything we find, document it all so he can't dismiss it." Jonas nodded, grateful for her practical thinking even in the midst of this nightmare. They worked together, moving from location to location, carefully excavating enough of each burial site to confirm the presence of remains and document them with photographs and video. Evelyn burned sage constantly, the smoke swirling around them in thick clouds, and Jonas could feel the difference it made, the way it pushed back against the spirits and gave them a small measure of breathing room. They found 3 more bodies in the next hour, bringing the total to 8, and Jonas was beginning to hope they might actually pull this off when the protection charm around his neck suddenly went cold. The heat vanished in an instant, replaced by an icy chill that made Jonas gasp, and he knew with terrible certainty that the charm had failed. The effect was immediate. The spirits that had been keeping their distance suddenly surged forward, their voices rising to a deafening roar, and Jonas felt hands, cold, wet, impossibly strong, grab his arms and start pulling him towards the water. He fought back, twisting and pulling, but there were too many of them and they were dragging him down into the stream. Evelyn screamed his name and grabbed his jacket, trying to pull him back, but the spirits were too strong. Jonas felt the water close over his head, felt himself being pulled down into depths that shouldn't exist in a shallow arroyo, and he realized with horror that this was it. This was how he was going to die. He was going to drown in 2 feet of water, pulled down by the spirits he'd been trying to save. But then he heard a voice, different from the others, speaking with authority and power. It was Thomas Begay, and the old man was standing at the edge of the stream, his arms raised, chanting in Navajo in a voice that seemed to shake the very air. Jonas felt the hands holding him loosen, felt the pressure ease, and suddenly he was able to surface, gasping for air. Evelyn pulled him out of the water and onto the bank, and Jonas lay there coughing and shaking while Thomas continued his chant. The spirits were retreating, pulling back from the sage smoke and the power of the traditional ceremony, and Jonas could see fear in their pale faces for the first time. Not fear of Thomas, he realized, but fear of something else, something that was rising from the depths of the arroyo. The water in the center of the stream began to churn and boil, and then something emerged from it, something that made Jonas's blood run cold. It was massive, easily 10 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be made of water and shadow in equal measure. Its face, if you could call it that, was a shifting mass of darkness, with eyes that glowed with a sickly green light, and when it opened its mouth, Jonas could see rows of teeth like broken glass. This was the water guardian that Daniel had warned him about, the thing that had been feeding on trapped spirits for generations, and now it was angry, furious that its food source was being threatened. The creature let out a roar that sounded like rushing water and crashing waves, and it lunged toward Thomas with impossible speed. But Thomas stood his ground, his chant never wavering, and he pulled something from his jacket, a small bundle wrapped in red cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a collection of turquoise stones carved with symbols, and he threw them into the water at the creature's feet. The stones hit the water and exploded with blue-white light, so bright that Jonas had to shield his eyes, and the creature shrieked in pain and rage. The light spread across the surface of the stream, forming a barrier, and the creature couldn't cross it. Thomas's voice rose, becoming more forceful, and Jonas realized the old man was performing an exorcism, banishing the creature back to whatever dark place it had come from. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted only a few minutes, but to Jonas it felt like hours. The creature thrashed and roared, trying to break through the barrier of light, but Thomas's ceremony held strong, and gradually the creature began to fade, its form becoming less solid, less real. Finally, with one last defiant scream, it dissolved into the water and was gone, leaving only ripples on the surface of the stream. Thomas lowered his arms, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion, and he nearly collapsed. Jonas and Evelyn rushed to his side, supporting him, and the old man managed a weak smile. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse. "The water guardian is banished. It will not return." Jonas looked around at the spirits that remained, and he saw that they were different now. The desperation and anger that had been driving them was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Daniel Gorman stepped forward, and Jonas could see that his form was already beginning to fade, becoming more transparent. "Thank you, Jonas," Daniel said, "for not giving up, for believing when no one else would. The others and I, we can move on now, but you need to finish what you started. Find all the bodies, give us proper burials, only then will we truly be free." Jonas nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I will. I promise." Daniel smiled, and then he was gone, fading into nothing like morning mist burned away by the sun. One by one, the other spirits followed, disappearing into the air, and within minutes, the arroyo was empty except for the 3 living people standing in the water. Thomas looked at Jonas with tired eyes. "How many bodies did you find?" Jonas checked his phone. 8 so far, but Daniel said there are more, scattered throughout the arroyo all the way up to where it forks. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then you need to bring in your department. You have enough evidence now to justify a full search. But Jonas, you need to be smart about how you present it. Tell them you were following up on leads, conducting an unauthorized search based on your missing persons research. Don't mention the spirits, don't mention the water guardian, just stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself." Jonas knew Thomas was right. He had 8 bodies, 8 pieces of undeniable proof that the arroyo was a mass burial site, and that was more than enough to force Captain So's hand. They climbed out of the arroyo as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, and Jonas called Captain So from his cell phone. The captain answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Nez, what the hell time is it?" Jonas took a deep breath. "Captain, I'm at the arroyo off Route 64. I need you to get here immediately and bring forensics. I've found multiple bodies." There was a long pause, and then So's voice came back, fully alert now. "You did what? Nez, I told you to stay away from that scene until—" Jonas cut him off. "Sir, with all due respect, I've found 8 bodies so far, and there are probably more. This is bigger than Daniel Gorman. This is a mass grave, and we need to move on it right now." So was silent for a moment, and then he said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes, and Nez, you better have a damn good explanation for why you were conducting an unauthorized search in the middle of the night." Jonas promised he would and hung up. He looked at Evelyn and Thomas, and he saw his own exhaustion and relief reflected in their faces. "It's over," Evelyn said softly. Jonas shook his head. "Not yet. We still have to find the rest of the bodies. Still have to give them proper burials. But the hard part, the dangerous part, that's done. The water guardian is gone, and the spirits can finally rest." Thomas placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "You did well, Officer Nez. Your grandmother would be proud." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Captain So arrived with a full forensic team and enough officers to secure the entire arroyo, and Jonas walked them through what he'd found, sticking to Thomas's advice and focusing on the facts rather than the supernatural elements. So was angry about the unauthorized search, and Jonas knew there would be consequences, but the captain couldn't argue with the results. By noon, the forensic team had confirmed all 8 bodies and begun the careful process of excavation and documentation. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the rest of the arroyo, and over the next 3 days they found 15 more bodies, bringing the total to 23, exactly the number Jonas had predicted from his missing persons research. The discovery made national news. Media outlets from across the country descended on Shiprock, calling it one of the largest mass grave discoveries in recent history. The FBI took over the investigation, and teams of forensic anthropologists worked around the clock to identify the remains and determine causes of death. Jonas was suspended from duty pending an internal review of his unauthorized search, but he didn't care. The bodies had been found. The families would finally have answers, and the spirits that had been trapped in that arroyo for so long could finally move on. Thomas Begay helped coordinate traditional burial ceremonies for the Navajo victims, and Jonas attended every single one, paying his respects to the people he'd helped bring home. Daniel Gorman was buried with full honors in a ceremony that brought out dozens of current and former tribal police officers. Jonas stood at attention during the service, his dress uniform crisp and pressed, and he felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. Daniel's spirit was at peace now, and that knowledge gave Jonas comfort. The internal review concluded 2 weeks later, and while Jonas received an official reprimand for conducting an unauthorized search, Captain Zoe also commended him for his dedication and the results of his investigation. Jonas was reinstated to active duty, and his missing persons research became the foundation for a new cold case unit within the tribal police department. But the arroyo itself remained closed, cordoned off with crime scene tape and warning signs. The forensic investigation continued for months, and even after all the bodies had been recovered and identified, there was something about that place that made people uneasy. Jonas never went back there, never wanted to. He'd seen enough of what lurked in those dark waters, had felt the pull of the water guardian trying to drag him down into the depths. He was content to let that place fade into memory, to become just another chapter in his career as a tribal police officer. Evelyn Curley never spoke publicly about what she'd witnessed that night, but Jonas would sometimes catch her staring off into space during her shifts, and he knew she was thinking about the spirits and the ceremony and the thing that had risen from the water. Thomas Begay became a regular consultant for the tribal police, helping with cases that involved traditional knowledge or spiritual elements, and Jonas developed a deep respect for the old man's wisdom and courage. One evening, about 6 months after the Arroyo incident, Jonas drove out to Thomas's trailer to thank him properly. They sat on the front steps as the sun set, sharing coffee and watching the desert turn gold and red in the fading light. "I never asked you how you knew to come to the Arroyo that night," Jonas said. Thomas smiled, a knowing expression on his weathered face. "The spirits told me. They reached out to me in my dreams, showed me what was happening, showed me that you needed help. I almost didn't make it in time." Jonas nodded, understanding. "What happened to the water guardian? Is it really gone, or did you just banish it temporarily?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I sent it back to the void, to the dark place between worlds where such things belong. But Officer Nez, you need to understand something. Creatures like that, they're part of the natural order, part of the balance between life and death. It wasn't evil in the way humans understand evil. It was just hungry, doing what its nature compelled it to do. I didn't destroy it because I couldn't, because doing so would have created an imbalance that might have caused even greater problems. I simply convinced it that this place was no longer a good hunting ground, that the cost of staying was too high." Jonas thought about that, about the idea that the water guardian was still out there somewhere, waiting and watching. "Will it come back?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe. In 100 years or 1,000, when people have forgotten what happened here, when the warnings have faded into legend. But not in our lifetime, and not in our children's lifetime. For now, it's gone, and the Arroyo is safe." Jonas had to be satisfied with that answer. He finished his coffee and stood up to leave, but Thomas called out to him. "Officer Nez, one more thing. What you did in that Arroyo, what you risked to bring those people home, that takes a special kind of courage. But it also marks you, changes you in ways you might not understand yet. You've walked between worlds now, touched the spirit realm, and that's not something you can undo. You'll see things other people don't see, hear things they don't hear. And sometimes the spirits will call on you for help, because they know you're someone who will listen." Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying this is going to keep happening? That I'm going to have more encounters like this?" Thomas's expression was sympathetic. "I'm saying that you've been given a gift and a burden in equal measure. What you do with it is up to you. You can choose to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't exist, or you can embrace it and use it to help people, both the living and the dead. But Officer Nez, understand that this choice will define the rest of your life." Jonas drove home that night with Thomas's words echoing in his mind, and he knew the old man was right. He'd crossed a threshold in that Arroyo, had touched something beyond the rational world he'd been trained to navigate as a police officer, and there was no going back. Over the following months, Jonas noticed changes in himself. He would sometimes see shadows moving in his peripheral vision, or hear voices on the wind that no one else seemed to notice. At first it frightened him, made him question his sanity, but gradually he came to accept it as part of who he was now. He wasn't crazy. He was just attuned to something most people couldn't perceive. And with Thomas's guidance, he learned to control it, to use it as a tool rather than letting it control him. He solved 2 more cold cases in the next year, both times following hunches and instincts that led him to evidence others had missed, and he began to develop a reputation within the department as someone with an almost supernatural ability to crack difficult cases. Captain So noticed the change in Jonas, though he never commented on it directly. Instead, he started assigning Jonas to the department's most challenging missing persons cases, trusting him to find answers where others had failed. And Jonas did, time and time again, using a combination of solid police work and his newfound sensitivity to the spirit world. He never spoke openly about his abilities, never tried to explain to his fellow officers how he knew the things he knew, but word spread anyway. Within the tribal police community, Jonas Nez became known as someone special, someone who could walk between worlds and bring home the lost. The arroyo off Route 64 remained closed for 3 years, while the investigation continued and the site was thoroughly documented. Eventually, after all the remains had been identified and returned to their families, the tribal council decided to turn the location into a memorial. A simple stone marker was placed at the entrance to the arroyo, listing the names of all 23 victims and dedicating the site to their memory. The arroyo itself was declared sacred ground, and access was restricted to authorized personnel only. Jonas attended the dedication ceremony, standing among the families of the victims and the officers who had worked the case, and he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The spirits were gone, moved on to wherever spirits go when their earthly business is finished, and the arroyo was just an arroyo again, nothing more. But Jonas never forgot what had happened there, never forgot the sound of Daniel Gorman's voice calling out for help, or the sight of the water guardian rising from the depths, or the feeling of those cold hands trying to pull him down into the darkness. Those memories stayed with him, sharp and clear, a reminder of how thin the veil between worlds really was, and how easily a person could slip from one side to the other. He kept the burned-out protection charm that Thomas had given him, tucking it away in a drawer at home as a memento, and sometimes, on quiet nights when he couldn't sleep, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the night that had changed his life forever. Years passed. Jonas was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant, and eventually he took over as head of the tribal police department's investigative division. He trained new officers, taught them to trust their instincts and never give up on a case, and a few of them, the ones who were particularly perceptive, who seemed to have that same sensitivity he'd developed, he would take aside and tell them about the arroyo. Not all the details, not the parts about the water guardian or the spirits, but enough to plant a seed, to let them know that the world was bigger and stranger than what they'd been taught in the academy. Some of them listened and understood. Others dismissed it as superstition. Jonas didn't mind either way. The knowledge was there for those who needed it, and that was all that mattered. On the 20th anniversary of the Arroyo incident, Jonas returned to the memorial site alone. He was in his 50s now, his hair going gray, his body bearing the wear and tear of decades in law enforcement. He stood before the stone marker and read the names carved into it, each one a life cut short, each one a family left to wonder and grieve. But they had answers now, because of what he'd done, because he'd been willing to listen when the spirits called out for help. Jonas placed his hand on the cold stone and closed his eyes, and for just a moment he felt them there with him. Daniel and all the others, not as the desperate, trapped spirits they'd been, but as something peaceful and whole. They were thanking him, he realized, acknowledging the debt they owed him for bringing them home. Jonas opened his eyes and smiled, a quiet, private smile, and then he turned and walked back to his truck. He had work to do, cases to solve, people to help. The world kept turning, the dead kept calling, and Jonas Nez kept answering. Because that's what guardians did. That's what it meant to walk between worlds, and he wouldn't have it any other way.